Do you remember the cheap dinners your grandparents cooked when money was tight? Not the holiday hams or the Sunday showpieces, but the plain weeknight suppers that turned a few coins and a bare shelf into a full table. This is a countdown of 100 of them, the meals that carried families through the Depression, through wartime rationing, and through the lean stretches that came after. Number 100, cream chipped beef on toast. You would know it by the salt first, that cured, meaty tang melting into a white sauce over a slice of toasted bread. The men who came home from the service had a rougher name for it, but in your grandmother's kitchen, it was simply a warm supper on a cold night. She melted a spoon of butter in the skillet, stirred flour in until it went the color of pale straw, then poured milk in slow and let it thicken into gravy. The dried beef, sliced thin as paper and rinsed first to pull out some of the salt, went in last and flavored the whole pan. Spooned over toast made from day-old bread. A few slices of the cheapest cured meat became dinner for everyone at the table. It cost next to nothing, and it kept on the shelf without an icebox, which mattered in homes where cold storage was a luxury few could count on. That was its quiet miracle. The trouble was the salt, heavy enough that a growing worry over blood pressure taught many cooks to rinse the beef twice and go light on the shaker. Now you find it dressed up on diner menus, sold back to you at a price that would have bought a week of it once. You remember it as the plate that turned an almost empty cupboard into something hot and filling, when even the dried beef ran short. What did your grandmother lay in the hot skillet to make the cheapest slice of meat sizzle like a payday treat? Number 99, fried bologna. The answer was a thick round of bologna, hitting the skillet with a sound that pulled children in from the yard. You watched your grandmother cut a small slit in the edge of each slice, so it would not dome up in the middle, and then it fried until the rim curled and browned, and the center went soft and hot. Bologna was the cheapest ring at the counter, the meat working families reached for when beef was a dream, and the paycheck was already spent. She laid it on white bread with a stripe of yellow mustard, and if the week had been kind, a slice of cheese melted underneath from the pan's own heat. The salt and the smoke of it filled you up in a way that felt bigger than its price. Some homes bought it as a whole ring and cut only what the meal needed, saving the rest, wasting nothing. The good of it was speed and comfort. A hot sandwich on the table in the time it took to butter the bread. The hard part was that it was fat and salt and little else. A filler that fed the body without much to build it. Children begged for it, and never once guessed it came from a thin weak rather than a full one. You can still hear that sizzle rise off the stove when the meat ran out entirely. What one pot did your grandmother build from a package of macaroni and whatever the cupboard still held? Number 98, Hoover stew. This was the pot that took its name in anger, called after President Herbert Hoover by the very people the hard times had cornered. In the shanty camps that folks bitterly named Hoovervilles, a shared pot of it simmered most of the day. You threw in macaroni for bulk, hot dogs sliced into coins, a can of corn, and a can of tomatoes, and you let the whole thing bubble until it stretched. One hot dog could flavor enough stew to feed a dozen hungry mouths in a soup line. The pasta gave you weight in the belly. The canned vegetables gave you what little nourishment the shelf allowed, and the sliced frank carried the taste of meat through every spoonful. Soup kitchens ladled out their own versions, swapping in whatever the donations brought that morning. Cabbage for corn or government cheese for the franks. The strength of it was that it fed a crowd from almost nothing and never asked for a fresh ingredient. The sting of it was the name, a daily reminder pinned to supper of exactly who was blamed and exactly how far a family had fallen. It was survival worn on the outside, poverty you could not pretend away. Today the same bowl gets called goulash or a pantry cleanout and nobody flinches. Back then it carried a grudge in its very title. When the stew pot was scraped clean, what humble cut turned a bag of dried beans into a supper that lasted for days. Number 97, ham hocks and beans. When the ham was eaten down to the joint, the bone was not trash. It was the next 3 suppers. You took that knuckly hock, packed with gristle and a few clinging bits of meat, and dropped it into a pot of navy beans that had soaked overnight. An onion went in, maybe a bay leaf if the spice drawer stretched that far, and then it simmered low all day. Hour by hour, the meat loosened from the bone in tender shreds, and the beans drank up the smoke until they turned soft and creamy. The hock was the cheapest thing at the butcher counter, sold for pennies, because the wealthy had already claimed the good cuts. Its one job was to flavor a pot, and it did that better than anything else in the store. Cornbread came alongside to sop up the rich brown liquor at the bottom of the bowl. What it gave you was real protein, and a stew that grew thicker and better each day it was reheated. What it cost you was time, a whole day of low heat and patience you had to plan the morning around. Farm families who butchered their own hogs smoked these hocks and hung them for winter, insurance against the months when fresh meat was gone. You can smell that pot filling the kitchen even now, when there was no ham bone to be had. How did your grandmother coax a full supper out of a few plain potatoes and a splash of milk? Number 96, potato soup. The potato was the friend that never quit on a poor kitchen, cheap, filling, and willing to grow in any patch of dirt. For a pot of potato soup, you needed only a few spuds, water, salt, and if the day allowed it, an onion and a splash of milk. You peeled and diced the potatoes, simmered them soft, then mashed a portion right against the side of the pot, so the starch thickened the broth without a drop of cream. That was the trick every thrifty cook carried in her hands. Bacon grease could stand in for butter in the pan. Wild onions from the spring woods could stand in for store-bought, and flour could carry the body when the milk ran out. Families with a cow stirred in real cream for a sundae. Families without leaned on the potato itself to make the bowl feel rich. In Irish immigrant homes, the soup carried the long memory of famine, when the potato had meant the difference between life and an empty grave. Its gift was that it filled a family for almost nothing and warmed a cold house from the inside out. Its limit was plainness, a soft and gentle supper that asked to be dressed up with pepper or a crumble of bacon to feel like a meal. You still reach for it when the weather turns or the wallet does. When the potatoes were gone too, what did your grandmother stretch a half-pound of ground beef into so it could feed the whole table? Number 95, American goulash. This one-pot bowl shared a name with a Hungarian classic and almost nothing else. You browned a half-pound of the cheapest ground beef in a deep pot, drained the fat, then added elbow macaroni and a can of tomato sauce and enough water to cook the pasta right there in the same pan. 15 minutes later, you had a thick, red, filling supper that tasted like a stripped-down version of every casserole your mother ever made. The tomato held it together. The pasta stretched the meat across far more plates than a half-pound had any right to fill, and the whole thing cost only a few coins. In many American kitchens through the 1960s and 1970s, this was just called goulash, a borrowed name worn by plain poverty food. Down south, some folks called it slumgullion. The good of it was that children ate it without complaint, and the leftovers tasted better on the second day, once the noodles had soaked up the sauce overnight. The cost was that it leaned heavy on starch, a lot of pasta wrapped around a little meat, more comfort than nourishment. Still, it turned a nearly empty grocery bag into 3 nights of supper. It fed the family and never once made a fuss about it. You can still taste that soft macaroni in the red gravy. When the ground beef was gone, what pantry can turn a handful of noodles into a casserole the whole family fought over? Number 94, tuna noodle casserole. When canned tuna became cheap and common, it changed how a tight household ate for good. You mixed a can of it with a handful of egg noodles, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and a scatter of peas if the freezer held any, then baked it until the top browned and the smell filled the whole house. That can of cream soup was the quiet engine of American home cooking for 40 years, turning anything it touched into something creamy and familiar. During the war, with beef and pork rationed, tuna became the patriotic swap, a protein you could get without spending your meat stamps. Navy wives especially leaned on it, stretching a single can further with chopped celery, a boiled egg, or a crumble of crackers on top. Churches and clubs made it in deep pans because it could feed a whole hall for the cost of a few tins. Its strength was exactly that reach. One can turned into supper for a family or a crowd. Its weakness was sameness, a soft and beige bowl that showed up so often on Wednesday nights that a whole generation can name the day by the smell. Some cooks fought the monotony with a crushed potato chip crust for crunch. You know that casserole the moment it comes out of the oven, when there was no tuna in the cupboard, What did your grandmother do with a single tin of pink salmon to put a hot patty on the plate? Number 93. Salmon patties. A can of pink salmon was one of the great bargains of a lean pantry, and your grandmother knew exactly what to do with it. She dumped the whole tin into a bowl, bones and all, and mashed it smooth. The soft little vertebrae crushed right in, and though nobody said so at the table, they carried the calcium a doctor would later praise. She bound the fish with a beaten egg and a handful of crushed crackers or a spoon of cornmeal, worked in a little chopped onion, and shaped the mix into flat cakes. Into a hot skillet slicked with grease they went, frying until the outsides turned deep gold and crisp. 2 patties over rice, or between slices of bread, fed a person well for pennies. The bones were the hidden gift, free calcium in an age when milk was not always on the table. The catch was that the frying wanted a steady hand and enough grease, since a pan too cool left them pale and falling apart. Families along both coasts leaned on canned fish through the winter, when the boat stayed in harbor and fresh catch was scarce. It was cheap, it held together, and it tasted like a real supper instead of a compromise. You can still hear that crust crackle in the pan, when even a can of fish felt like a splurge. What strong-flavored cut did your grandmother fry to turn a few pennies of meat into a full plate? Fry to turn a few pennies of meat into a full plate. Number 92. Liver and onions. Liver was the cut nobody wealthy wanted, which is exactly why it landed on so many poor tables. You could buy a slab of beef or pork liver for a fraction of a steak, and your grandmother turned it into a supper that stuck to your ribs. She sliced it thin, dusted it in seasoned flour, and laid it in a skillet where a mound of onions had already gone soft and sweet in the grease. The liver cooked fast, just enough to firm up, because too long over the heat turned it to shoe leather, and every cook knew it. The sweetness of those long-cooked onions was the whole point, a mellow blanket over the strong iron taste of the meat. Cheap as it was, liver carried more iron and vitamins than almost anything else at the counter. Real nourishment for children in their growing years, and for men worn down by hard labor. That was its gift, a bargain cut that fed the blood. Its trouble was the flavor, sharp and mineral and easy to ruin. A taste that split families right down the middle at the table. Some grandchildren still cannot smell it without a shudder. Others would trade a fancy dinner to have that plate back one more time. You knew which one you were the moment it hit the pan. When beef or pork liver was still too dear, what canned meat did your grandmother slice and fry to fake the feel of a real chop? Number 91. Fried Spam. When it hit the shelves in 1937, that little blue can of spiced ham changed what a working family could afford to call meat. You opened the tin, slid the pink block out in one piece, and sliced it thick. In a hot skillet, each slice fried until the edges went crisp and caramel brown, and the smell turned almost like real ham. Laid on bread with mustard or served beside eggs, it became a supper that felt richer than its price. The can kept for years without cold storage, which made it a treasure in homes where the icebox was unreliable or absent. During the war, soldiers ate mountains of it and carried the taste home after. And in Hawaii, it took such deep root that it never left the plate. Its strength was reliability, a shelf-stable meat you could count on when the fresh counter was empty or rationed. Its weakness was the salt and the fat, a heavy slice that filled you without doing much else for you. Cooks fought the plainness with a smear of mustard or a ring of pineapple when the budget allowed a little sweetness. Families kept a stack of cans in the cupboard like coins in a jar. Sure, that supper was always one twist of a key away. You either grew up loving that crisp fried edge, or you never quite came around to it. When the can was empty, what cheap pairing turned a package of hot dogs and a few potatoes into a whole skillet supper? Number 90. Hot dogs and potatoes. Some folks just called it the poor man's meal, and the name told you everything. You diced a few potatoes and fried them in a skillet until they were nearly done, then dropped in sliced hot dogs to brown at the edges. And if you had an onion, that went in too for sweetness and smell. The cheap Franks did the clever work here, giving the whole pan the look and the taste of a meat supper, while actually spreading a small amount of processed meat across many forkfuls. Children loved it, and never suspected it was born of a thin wallet rather than a full one. Many families bought the hot dogs last on the shopping trip, spending whatever coins were left after the flour, and the potatoes were paid for. The Franks kept well and asked for no icebox until the package was open, which suited homes where cold storage could not be trusted. Its strength was ease and cheer, a fast skillet supper that pleased the pickiest eater in the house. Its weakness was nutrition, a plate of starch and fat with little green to balance it. Still, it stretched $1 into a filling meal that felt like a small celebration. Some grown men asked for it as their birthday dinner, the taste tied to security, and a full kitchen more than to any restaurant. You can still hear those Franks pop as they hit the hot grease. When you wanted that same combination baked instead of fried, what did your grandmother stir together with a can of beans? Number 89. Franks and beans. When the oven was on and the budget was thin, Franks and beans became the easiest supper in the house. You opened a can of baked beans, sliced a few hot dogs into it, maybe stirred in a spoon of mustard or a little brown sugar, and baked it until the top bubbled and browned. Some cooks skipped the oven entirely and just warmed it all in a pot on the stove, ready in the time it took to set the table. The beans brought a sweet, molasses-dark body, and the Franks brought the meat, and together they filled a growing child right up. It was a staple in homes where a big family met a small paycheck, and it packed just as easily into a lunch pail or a camp cook set. Cowboys and campers had leaned on the same pairing for years, warming a can over an open fire when a kitchen was miles away. Its gift was speed and thrift, a hot and hearty bowl from 2 of the cheapest cans on the shelf. Its cost was the salt and the sugar, a supper long on comfort and short on anything fresh. Cooks who wanted more crumbled a strip of bacon or a chopped onion over the top. You know that sweet, smoky smell rising from the pot. When the meat had to disappear entirely, what did your grandmother make from a head of cabbage and a bag of noodles that still tasted like a feast? Number 88. Cabbage and noodles. A head of cabbage and a bag of egg noodles could feed a family for next to nothing. And in the mill towns where Eastern European families settled, this was the dish that did it. You chopped the cabbage and cooked it slow in butter or bacon grease until it collapsed and turned sweet and golden at the edges. Then folded in the boiled noodles and seasoned it all with salt, pepper, and sometimes a pinch of caraway. In Slovak, Polish, and Hungarian homes, it went by the name haluski, and it carried the old country straight into an American kitchen. The cabbage kept for weeks in a cold cellar through the winter, and the noodles could be rolled and cut at home from flour and an egg when there was no money for the store-bought box. Its strength was comfort and reach, a warm and filling supper from 2 ingredients that cost almost nothing. Its weakness was that it was soft and plain, a meatless plate that asked for a good hand with the seasoning to sing. The smell of cabbage cooking marked the tenement halls as clearly as any nameplate, a scent some found humbling and others wore with pride. It fed the body and tied you to a homeland at the same time. You can still see that cabbage going gold in the pan. When the noodles ran out, what did your grandmother grate and fry to turn a few potatoes into crisp golden cakes? Number 87. Potato pancakes. When there was no meat to build a meal around, the potato itself became the supper. You grated raw potatoes by hand, and many a knuckle got scraped in the doing. Then mixed the shreds with a little flour, an egg if the hens were laying, and a grate of onion for flavor. The batter went into a skillet with a shallow pool of hot grease, and fried until the outsides crisped up brown, and the inside stayed soft and steaming. Served with a spoon of homemade applesauce, or just salt and pepper. These cakes filled a hungry family for the price of a few potatoes most people could grow in the yard. Different homes had different names for the same thrift. Jewish families called them latkes, German families Kartoffelpuffer, and the same economic need sat behind every one of them. The gift was that potatoes grew almost anywhere and stored all winter, so the makings were rarely far off. The cost was the labor, all that hand grating before a single cake hit the pan. The sound and smell of them frying could turn a cold, half-heated house into a warm and fragrant place. From almost nothing but effort, the applesauce served alongside was no small thing. Its cool sweetness cutting the richness of the fried potato in a pairing families swore by for generations. You can still feel the scrape of that old box grater when the potatoes were boiled instead of fried. What golden cornmeal supper did your grandmother stir on the stove for half an hour? Number 86. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal was one of the cheapest bags in the store, and from it, your grandmother built a supper that stretched 3 ways. She stirred the meal slowly into boiling, salted water and stood at the stove for a good half hour, working the lumps out with a wooden spoon until the pot turned thick and smooth. Eaten warm with a little milk, or butter and syrup on a good morning, it was breakfast, poured into a pan and left to set firm, then sliced and fried in bacon grease until crusty. It became a whole other supper the next day. That double life was its genius. One cheap ingredient carried across 2 meals with nothing wasted. The rhythmic stirring turned almost meditative for the cook, who could not afford to walk away and let it scorch. Regional tastes split the pot, sweeter down south, more often savory up north, proof that even the plainest food grows its own local pride. The gift was thrift and warmth, a filling bowl from pennies of meal. The cost was time and attention, a supper that punished a wandering mind with a lumpy or burnt pot. The scrape of a knife slicing cold mush at dawn told the sleeping house that food was already on its way. You can still smell that fried slice browning in the grease. When there was a little ground beef to work with, what one-pot stew did your grandmother build with corn, tomatoes, and a couple of potatoes? Number 85, Depression Stew. This was the pot with no proper name, penciled into the margins of old cookbooks as simply stew. You browned whatever ground beef you could afford, even the cheapest tube from the discount rack, then added a can of tomatoes, a can of corn, a couple of diced potatoes, and enough water to bring it together. Salt, pepper, and a low simmer did the rest. The potatoes broke down as they cooked and thickened the broth. The corn gave it sweetness. The tomatoes gave it a bright edge of acid. And the beef, small as the portion was, turned it into a meal that held you until morning. Housewives whispered this one to their daughters like a plain kind of inheritance, a recipe that said no matter how bad the week got, there would be supper tonight. Its strength was reach, a single pot that fed a family for days and cost only a handful of coins. Its weakness was sameness, the same bowl reheated night after night until the last spoonful was gone. For a family on a fixed and shrinking income, that repetition was a small price for the certainty of a full stomach. A single pot cost only a handful of coins and could carry a family clear from Sunday to Wednesday. The same nameless recipe turning up in kitchen after kitchen. You can still see that pot bubbling low on the back burner. When the beef was gone and only odd vegetables were left, what soup did your grandmother build from whatever the crisper still held? Number 84, Vegetable Beef Soup. This was the supper that cleaned out the crisper drawer, and every resourceful cook knew it by heart. The celery going limp, the carrots turning soft, the half onion wrapped in paper, the potato with eyes starting to sprout. All of it went into the pot. You browned a little stew meat first, the cheapest cut with the most bone and gristle, then piled everything else on top with a can of tomatoes and enough water to cover, and let it simmer until the windows fogged. An hour or 2 of low heat pulled a deep, savory broth out of scraps most kitchens would have tossed. The genius was that no 2 pots ever tasted alike, because no 2 weeks left the same odds and ends behind. That built-in variety kept supper interesting when the budget allowed for none of its own. Its gift was thrift and warmth, a full meal from what was already paid for and about to spoil. Its cost was the meat, a stretch of tough cut that needed long cooking before it gave up and went tender. For a family watching every scrap, this soup answered the quiet guilt of waste. The bone was the quiet foundation. A cheap cut simmered until it gave up every bit of its marrow and richness to the broth. You can still see the steam rising off that bowl on a cold night, when there was no meat scrap at all. What did your grandmother simmer from a bag of dried split peas and an old ham bone? Number 83, Split Pea Soup. A bag of split peas was one of the cheapest sources of real nourishment in the store, and a leftover ham bone gave it a soul. You dropped the peas into a pot with that bone, a carrot and water, and let it go for an hour or more, until the peas dissolved into a thick green porridge, and the bone surrendered its last trace of smoke. The finished soup was dense enough to stand a spoon straight up in. In cafeterias and mess halls across the country, through the 1950s and 1960s, this was standard fare, cheap and filling, and nearly impossible to ruin. That forgiveness was part of its worth. You could walk away from the stove, forget it for 20 minutes, and it would only turn thicker instead of scorching, which mattered in a busy or a tired kitchen. Its strength was body and price, a supper that stuck to the ribs for almost nothing. Its weakness was color and plainness, a heavy green bowl that could feel like duty without a good hand on the pepper. The Depression generation knew this soup the way they knew their own names. Cooked so many times it lived in the muscle. A splash of vinegar at the end brightened the whole pot and cut clean through all that heavy green richness. You can still smell that ham bone giving itself up to the pot. When there was no ham bone to spare, what plain white bean did your grandmother simmer into a soup? The United States Senate still serves every single day. Number 82. Navy bean soup. If the ham bone version was the special one, plain navy bean soup was the weeknight workhorse, and it asked for no bone at all. You needed only a bag of dried navy beans, an onion, a couple of stalks of celery and salt, then 2 hours of low simmering until the beans burst open and their own starch thickened the broth into a creamy white soup. Some cooks brightened the pot at the end with a splash of vinegar. Some dropped in a bay leaf. The plain recipe worked just fine on its own. The United States Senate cafeteria has served navy bean soup every single day since 1903, and the reason is plain thrift. Because it is cheap and filling, and every senator who grew up poor recognized the taste of home in it. That is its whole strength. A nickel's worth of dried beans turned into a bowl that ate like far more. Its weakness was time. The long, unhurried simmer a busy day could not always spare. For a family stretching $1 to its edge, a 2-pound bag of these beans made enough soup to last most of a week. It fed you plainly, and it fed you well. You can still see that pot going creamy on the stove. When you wanted that same cheap bean turned into a Monday supper with a little smoke and spice, what New Orleans pot did your grandmother put on to simmer all day? Number 81. Red beans and rice. In New Orleans, this was the Monday meal, born from the old rhythm of washing clothes all day, while a pot took care of itself on the back burner. You cooked a pound of dried red kidney beans low and slow, with a link of smoked sausage, an onion, a green pepper, and a stalk of celery, and let it go for hours until the beans turned creamy, and the sausage gave its smoke to the whole pot. Served over a scoop of white rice, it fed a family richly for the price of a few cheap ingredients. The beauty for a working household was that it asked so little of you once it was going. No stirring, no watching, just a low flame and time. Louis Armstrong loved it so much, he signed his letters "Red Beans and Ricely Yours," which tells you how deep the dish ran in that city. Its strength was flavor and thrift, a deeply satisfying supper that cost almost nothing to build. Its weakness was the long cook, half a day of simmering before the beans finally softened. Down the block, a neighbor's pot would be going too, the smell of Monday drifting through the whole street. The pot went on at midday and looked after itself while the wash was done. So supper was ready the moment the last shirt was hung on the line. You can still see those beans turning creamy in the pot. When the beans were gone and only breakfast makings remained, what gravy did your grandmother whip up to pour over a plate of biscuits? Number 80. Egg gravy over biscuits. When a family kept chickens, a couple of eggs could be stretched to feed several mouths. And egg gravy was how you did it. You heated a little fat in a pan, saved bacon grease or lard, stirred in flour to make a roux, then added water or milk to build a gravy. Then you beat 1 or 2 eggs and stirred them into the hot, not boiling, gravy, so they cooked in soft threads all through the pan, carrying egg flavor into every spoonful. Poured over split biscuits or a slice of bread, it turned almost nothing into a hot supper for the whole family. The timing was the whole skill, since too much heat scrambled the eggs into hard bits instead of the delicate ribbons you wanted. Many homes kept hens for exactly this, and the morning's egg count often decided whether egg gravy would appear that night. Its gift was reach, 1 or 2 eggs feeding a table full of people. Its cost was that skill and attention, a gravy that could break or scorch if you looked away. Children counted the pale threads in their bowls, hunting for proof of their own hen's work. For a family with a few hens out back, this was how a thin week still ended in a hot, filling supper that tasted of the morning's eggs. You can still see those egg ribbons winding through the gravy. When the hens quit laying, what garden gravy did your grandmother pour over those same biscuits instead? Number 79. Tomato gravy. When the garden gave up its tomatoes, but the pantry held little else, tomato Gravy turned a plain plate of biscuits into a meal. You started with bacon grease or butter in the skillet, stirred in flour to thicken, then poured in fresh or home-canned tomatoes, and let it cook down into a tangy, rust-red gravy. Salt, pepper, and sometimes a pinch of sugar rounded it out. Ladled over split biscuits, rice, or even plain white bread, it brought both brightness and body to a meal that would otherwise be dry starch. For many families, this meatless supper appeared week after week when money was short, leaning on homegrown produce to make up for the store-bought protein they could not buy. In winter, the jars of tomatoes put up the summer before became kitchen gold, each one rationed to last until the next growing season. The distinctive pop of a sealing jar in a steamy summer kitchen meant winter suppers were already accounted for. Its strength was color and thrift, a cheerful, tangy plate that cost only what the garden gave. Its weakness was that it was meatless and soft, a supper that needed a good biscuit under it to feel like enough. In Appalachian homes, it stayed beloved long after the pantries filled back up. You can still taste that tang cutting through a warm biscuit. When there was a scrap of sausage to spare, what peppery white gravy did your grandmother pour over those same biscuits at dawn? Number 78. Biscuits and sawmill gravy. Southern kitchens turned flour, grease, and milk into a filling supper through the plain magic of biscuits and gravy. The biscuits asked for almost nothing: flour, lard, or bacon grease, salt, and a little leavening. The gravy came from a spoonful of grease and flour cooked together, then loosened with milk, until it thickened into a creamy white sauce that covered the plate. In leaner weeks, the gravy held little meat, maybe crumbled bits of salt pork or the last scraps of sausage, and the flavor came instead from a heavy hand with the black pepper. Those liberal shakes turned the gravy gray-speckled and gave the impression of more meat than the pan ever held. Folks called it sawmill gravy in the logging camps, where it fueled men through brutal mornings. A single link of sausage, crumbled fine, could flavor enough gravy to cover a whole pan of biscuits and fool a table into thinking it had eaten well. Its strength was cheap energy, a hearty plate of fat and starch that carried a farmer through chores or a mill hand through a long shift. Its weakness was exactly that richness, heavy fuel with little green or fresh to balance it. Even now, diners serve this humble plate, though few remember it began in genuine want. You can still see that pepper flecked through the white gravy. When even flour and milk ran low, what did your grandmother do with a few chunks of stale bread to make a warm supper? Number 77. Bread soup. When bread went too stale for a sandwich but was far too precious to throw out, it became soup. You tore the hard chunks into a pot and simmered them in hot water or a thin broth until they softened and swelled and thickened the whole thing into a rough porridge. Then you seasoned it with whatever the shelf held: a clove of garlic, salt, pepper, dried herbs from the garden, and a drizzle of olive oil for an Italian family, or a spoon of lard for another. Nearly every people facing an empty pantry found their own version of this trick. Italian households called theirs papa al pomodoro, or ribollita. Spanish homes made sopa de ajo, and Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens simmered bread and milk with butter and onion into what they called brown soup. Its strength was that it wasted nothing and warmed a bare kitchen on the nights the cupboard was nearly empty. Its weakness was plainness, a soft and humble bowl that leaned on the cook's seasoning to lift it past survival. Women traded their secret touches over the back fence, building a kind of community out of shared hard times. It took the least promising thing in the kitchen and made it warm and filling. In the leanest weeks, a hard heel of bread and a pot of water were all it took to put something warm on the table. You can still smell that garlic softening the stale crusts. When the bread was better soaked in something sweeter, what gentle supper did your grandmother make for a sick child from milk and toast? Number 76. Milk toast. Milk toast was as plain as its name and as gentle as a hand on a fevered forehead. You toasted a slice of bread, laid it in a bowl, and poured warm milk over it, then sweetened it with a little sugar or turned it savory with salt and pepper, depending on the need. For many children, this simple dish meant comfort during an illness, when appetites were low and a worried parent needed to get something, anything, into them. The soft, easy mixture asked for almost no chewing and delivered the calcium and calories of the milk in the gentlest form. The making of it became tied up with care itself, mothers and grandmothers fixing it, while pressing a palm to a hot little forehead. It shows up all through the writing of that era, named as the first food given to a recovering patient, or the comfort offered in a hard hour. Its strength was gentleness and thrift, 3 plain things turned into nourishment for the youngest and the oldest at the table. Its weakness was that it was thin and mild, a convalescent's meal more than a laborer's supper. Every home had its own rule, whether to pour the milk over the toast or dip the toast down into the milk. You can still feel the warmth of that bowl held in 2 hands. When a family kept chickens and could spare a bird's cheaper parts, what did your grandmother simmer over rice to make a rich supper? Number 75. Chicken thigh and rice. Chicken thighs were the forgotten cut for decades, priced at half of what breasts cost, because so many Americans were sure white meat was better. The families who knew better bought thighs by the pound and made a supper that tasted twice as rich. You browned the thighs in a pot, added a cup of rice, a scoop of chicken broth, and whatever seasoning the shelf held, then covered it and let it simmer until the rice drank up every drop of the chicken-flavored liquid and the dark meat fell off the bone at the touch of a fork. The fat in those thighs was the whole secret, keeping the rice moist and the meat succulent in a way lean breast never could. For a family stretching a small bird a long way, that richness meant the difference between a full plate and picked-at leftovers. Its strength was flavor and price, a deeply satisfying one-pot meal from the cheapest part of the chicken. Its weakness was almost nothing, unless you counted the bones a child had to work around. This was the dish a grandmother could make in her sleep, the same every time. Tasting like the kitchen was still alive with people. The bones left in the pot gave the broth even more body, so not a scrap of that cheap cut ever went to waste. You can still smell that broth soaking into the rice. When the chicken was picked clean, what tiny cut did your grandmother fry so nothing of the bird went to waste? Number 74. Chicken livers and rice. Nothing of a chicken went into the trash in a careful kitchen, and the livers were a small treasure most households prized. You dredged them in seasoned flour and fried them fast in hot grease until the outsides crisped and the inside stayed just pink and tender. Then served them over rice or alongside biscuits with a little pan gravy. Rich, dark, and packed with iron, a handful of livers gave a cheap and powerful jolt of nourishment for pennies. Rural families who raised their own chickens leaned on this the most, using every part of a bird they had fed and killed themselves. Some cooks stretched the livers further with a chopped onion softened in the same pan, or a boiled egg worked in for bulk. Its strength was nutrition and thrift, exceptional iron and protein from a scrap most stores nearly gave away. Its weakness was the flavor, strong and mineral in the way liver always is, a taste not every child took to, but farm kids who grew up on it often carried the fondness for life. It was whole animal eating long before anyone thought to call it that, done out of need rather than fashion. A little pan gravy made from the brown bits stretched the livers even further, spooned over the rice so nothing rich was left behind. You can still hear those livers spitting in the pan. When even the livers were gone, what did your grandmother do with the neck and gizzards to build a gravy over rice? Number 73. Giblet gravy over rice. The neck, the gizzard, the heart, the bits most folks now throw out, made a giblet gravy that turned a plate of rice into a real supper. You simmered those tough odd pieces slow in water with an onion until the meat gave up and went tender, then chopped them fine and stirred them back into a gravy thickened from the broth and a little flour. Some cooks folded in a chopped boiled egg to stretch it further and give it richness. Poured over rice or biscuits, it fed a family on the parts of the bird that cost nothing at all. In southern kitchens, this was ordinary Sunday know-how. The giblets from the roasting hen never wasted, but worked into the meal alongside it. For families who kept a flock, that neck and those giblets were counted into supper before the hen was ever plucked. Its strength was thrift raised to an art, a savory gravy built entirely from the scraps of a single chicken. Its weakness was the labor, all that slow simmering and fine chopping to coax supper out of the toughest little bits. The gizzard especially took time and patience before it finally turned tender. It carried the whole flavor of the bird into every spoonful. You can still smell that giblet broth cooking down. When the yard birds could not stretch far enough, What wild game did your grandmother stew when a man came home with a full gunny sack? Number 72. Rabbit stew. When the garden failed and the smokehouse emptied, men took a shotgun into the fields, and a wild rabbit meant free protein for a rural family willing to hunt. The lean meat needed long, slow cooking to turn tender, so it went into a stew with root vegetables, carrots, potatoes, onions, whatever grew out back. In the pot, the rabbit stretched much further than it ever would have roasted whole, and every bit of its flavor leached into the broth, which then soaked up into dumplings dropped on top. During the war, with beef and pork rationed, government pamphlets pushed families to raise rabbits in their victory gardens, since a hutch could turn garden scraps and weeds into meat. In the towns, folks did the same with what the fields offered. No shame in it when the alternative was an empty plate. Its strength was that it cost nothing but a shell and an afternoon, real meat on the table when the money for it was gone. Its weakness was the work and the stomach for it, the hunting, the cleaning, and the hard lesson children learned early. You did not name the animals in the hutch because they were supper, not pets. It taught a plain kind of resourcefulness that stayed with a person for life. You can still smell that stew thickening with the dumplings on top. When rabbits were scarce, what smaller game did your grandmother drop into a pot with dumplings to feed the family? Number 71. Squirrel and dumplings. During the hardest years, squirrel turned up on tables far beyond the country. In city neighborhoods too, wherever a man could take one with a rifle. As money vanished, people picked up hunting skills to fill the gaps in the diet, and the humble squirrel gave crucial protein when other meat was out of reach. Those who tried it found the meat milder than they expected, closer to a salty, tender little bird than to anything gamey. You simmered it low and slow until the meat loosened from the tiny bones, then dropped spoonfuls of biscuit dough into the broth to puff up into dumplings that soaked in the flavor. Prepared with just salt, pepper, and patience, it was survival cooking at its most bare. A pot of it could stretch 2 or 3 squirrels across a whole family, with the dumplings doing the real filling work. Its strength was that it cost only the effort of the hunt, meat for free when the butcher was a stranger you could not afford. Its weakness was the labor and the small yield, a lot of careful work around little bones for a modest bowl. It strikes modern ears as strange, but it fed families through a desperate stretch and asked no apology for it. The broth carried all the flavor the small carcass gave up, and the dumplings soaked it in until the pot was clean. You can still picture that pot of dumplings simmering over squirrel when no game came home at all. What preserved fish did your grandmother flake into a creamy gravy over potatoes? Number 70. Codfish gravy. Salt cod was a plank of preserved fish, hard and white and stiff, that kept without ice for months and could be bought cheap by the pound. Before it was any use, you had to soak it, often overnight with the water changed more than once, to pull out enough salt to make it fit to eat. Then you flaked it and stirred it into a white sauce built from grease, flour, and milk, and poured that creamy gravy over boiled potatoes or split biscuits. It was insurance against hunger, a protein that traveled well inland and stored nearly forever, ready whenever the fresh meat and the money both ran out. Fishing families along both coasts leaned on it through the winter, when the boats stayed tied up in harbor. Catholic households ate it through Lent, turning a religious rule into practical thrift on a Friday. Its strength was that it kept and it stretched real fish protein from a shelf-stable slab. Its weakness was the salt and the soak, a strong flavor that challenged a child's palate and a preparation that took planning a day ahead. Cooks softened it with a chopped boiled egg for richness and a gentler taste. A boiled potato underneath turned it into a full plate, the creamy fish gravy soaking down into the soft, plain starch. You can still smell that salty fish softening into the cream. When fresh fish came out of the river instead of a barrel, what did your grandmother roll in cornmeal and fry crisp for supper? Number 69. Fried catfish. For families near a river or a pond, supper sometimes came up on the end of a cane pole, and catfish was the reliable catch. The fish were bottom feeders, plentiful and free to anyone with patience and a line, and their firm white flesh took beautifully to the pan. You cleaned them, rolled the fillets or whole small fish in seasoned cornmeal, and dropped them into a skillet of hot grease until the cornmeal crust turned deep gold and crackling. Served with a wedge of onion, a hunk of cornbread, or a spoon of slaw. It was a feast that cost only the bait and the afternoon. Whole communities, especially across the rural South, built Friday fish fries around this catch, turning free protein into a gathering. Children learned to bait a hook young, and a good stringer of catfish meant the family ate like kings that night for nothing. Its strength was that the river restocked itself, meat that came without a single coin changing hands. Its weakness was the work of cleaning and the luck of the catch, since some evenings the fish just did not bite. The cornmeal crust was the signature, crisp and gritty and golden in a way flour never managed. A dab of homemade tartar sauce or a squeeze of lemon, when the kitchen had it, was all the dressing that crisp fish ever needed. You can still hear that cornmeal crust snapping in the grease. When there was no fish at all, what did your grandmother stir up from 2 cans of corn and a potato to make a creamy chowder? 2 cans of corn and a potato to make a creamy chowder. Number 68, corn chowder. A can of creamed corn and a can of whole kernel corn could become one of the cheapest and most comforting suppers a family ever tasted. You simmered a diced potato in a little water until tender, poured in both cans of corn and a cup of milk, and let the whole thing heat through until it thickened into a golden, sweet, velvety soup. The creamed corn did clever double duty as its own thickener, so there was no roux to make and no lumps to fight. Some cooks crumbled a strip of bacon on top, and some shook in a pinch of cayenne, but the plain base needed nothing else to satisfy. Midwest farm wives made this when the canned corn from a good harvest lasted for years in the cellar. For a household worried about a diabetic at the table, you could leave the potato out, and the creamed corn still held the soup together. Its strength was ease and thrift, a rich-tasting bowl from 2 of the cheapest cans on the shelf, and a single potato. Its weakness was the sweetness and starch, a soup that leaned soft and mild, without a little pepper or smoke to sharpen it. For a family stretching pennies, it delivered warmth and comfort far past its cost. You can still see that chowder going golden in the pot. When even the cans ran low, what did your grandmother build from just 2 potatoes, an onion, and a knob of grease? Number 67, potato and onion stew. If you grew up poor in Appalachia, you knew this pot without ever needing a recipe. 2 potatoes, 1 onion, a knob of butter or a spoon of bacon grease, water and salt. That was the whole of it. You sliced the potatoes thin, diced the onion, dropped everything into a pot, and let it simmer until the potatoes broke apart and thickened the broth into something creamy without a drop of cream. The bacon grease gave it a ghost of smoke that made it taste richer than it had any right to. For a family down to the last coins of the month, this was a plain miracle. Potatoes cost pennies, onions kept for weeks in the bin, and the whole thing could be made by a tired cook without lifting anything heavier than a wooden spoon. Its strength was cheapness and ease, a warm and creamy supper from 2 of the humblest things in the kitchen. Its weakness was plainness, a soft bowl that begged for a little pepper or a crumble of bacon to lift it past survival. Church women in West Virginia still carry this to homebound neighbors in mason jars, and it reheats perfectly the next day. In the coal fields and the hollows, this was Monday's supper as often as any, a bowl that asked nothing of a worn-out cook. You can still taste that smoky richness with no cream in sight. When a link of smoked sausage could be spared, what did your grandmother pair with a head of cabbage for supper? Number 66, cabbage and sausage. 1 head of cabbage, 2 or 3 links of smoked sausage, and a pot of water made the entire shopping list. You quartered the cabbage, sliced the sausage into thick coins, and let them simmer together for the better part of an hour, until the cabbage turned silky and sweet, and the sausage perfumed the broth with garlic and smoke. A head of cabbage cost less than $1 and could feed a person for 3 days, and smoked sausage kept for weeks in the icebox without turning. For a cook with arthritis in the hands, there was almost no knife work to dread. You could tear the cabbage apart and snap the sausage links, and the pot did the rest. Polish grandmothers in Chicago made this every week, and German families in Wisconsin made it every winter, because poverty never cared where your people came from. Its strength was ease and reach, a hearty supper for pennies that asked almost nothing of the cook. Its weakness was plainness and salt, a heavy pot that leaned on the 1 sausage link for all its flavor. Still, it filled a kitchen with a smell that said supper was handled. One pot fed a family for the better part of a week, the flavor only deepening as the cabbage sat in the smoky broth and was warmed over again. You can still smell that cabbage going sweet with the smoke. When the sausage had to stretch even further, what beans did your grandmother simmer it into for a heartier stew? Number 65. Sausage and white bean stew. When a link or two of smoked sausage had to carry a whole pot, this stew was the answer. You sliced the sausage into rounds, browned it to wake up the smoke, then added a can of white beans, a can of diced tomatoes, and a handful of spinach or greens if the crisper held any. 20 minutes of simmering pulled it all together into a bowl that actually looked like a real dinner. The sausage gave it smoke, the beans gave it body, the tomatoes gave it brightness, and the greens wilting in added the iron that many a household was short on. This was the pot you could set in front of company without apology, hearty and colorful in a way that plain beans never managed. The psychology of it mattered as much as the nutrition, because a bowl that looked like a meal made a person feel cared for. Its strength was that it ate rich and full for very little. One link of sausage flavoring the whole thing. Its weakness was the salt in the sausage and the reliance on cans, a convenience that cost a little more than dried beans from scratch. For a family losing its taste for the same old bowls, this one felt like a step up. You can still see that broth going red around the beans. When you wanted a bean with real southern soul and a little smoke, what did your grandmother simmer with a ham hock for a New Year's kind of luck? Number 64. Black-eyed peas. In the South, black-eyed peas were not just New Year's luck. They were a weeknight lifeline. You simmered a bag of the dried peas with a ham hock, an onion, and a can of diced tomatoes until everything melted together into a thick, smoky, faintly tangy stew that tasted like the whole long history of Southern poverty cooking in one bowl. The ham hock was the cheapest thing at the butcher counter, often less than $1 a pound, and it existed for exactly one purpose: to give its smoke and salt to a pot of beans. Families in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia made this on the first of the month when the check came in, buying enough dried peas and hocks to last until the next one arrived. Served over rice, it stretched even further into a dish some called Hoppin' John. Its strength was reach and flavor, a single pot feeding a person for 4 or 5 days for pennies. Its weakness was the long cook and the salt of the hock, a supper you had to plan a whole morning around. This was not cuisine so much as quiet engineering, a way to turn $1 into a week. On New Year's Day, a bowl of them promised luck and a coin in your pocket, a tradition that carried the humble dish right onto the holiday table. You can still smell that ham hock smoking through the peas. When you wanted a bean that cooked fast and needed no soaking at all, what did your grandmother reach for on a busy night? Number 63. Lentil and carrot stew. Lentils were the bean in a hurry, since unlike their dried cousins, they needed no soaking and cooked down in half an hour. You dropped a cup of them into a pot with 2 carrots, an onion and water, and let them go until they broke down into a thick, earthy porridge that stuck to your ribs and held off hunger for hours. The carrots gave it sweetness, the onion gave it depth, and the whole thing cost less than $1 to build. Depression-era mothers wrote this on index cards and tucked them into their daughters' recipe boxes as a plain kind of protection against the hard weeks ahead. What nutritionists now praise as a superfood, packed with protein, fiber, iron, and folate, poor families ate for years without knowing a word of the science, quietly doing better than folks who spent 5 times as much. Its strength was speed and nourishment, a rich and filling pot with no soaking and no meat required. Its weakness was plainness, a humble brown bowl that asked for a good pinch of salt and pepper to shine. Immigrant kitchens brought this dish from a dozen homelands, and it settled easily into American thrift. A splash of vinegar or a squeeze of lemon at the end woke the whole pot up, cutting through the earthy weight of the lentils. You can still smell that earthy pot simmering down. When there was a bit of tough beef to work in, what grain did your grandmother add to build a soup that stuck with you all day? Number 62. Beef barley soup. Barley was one of the great forgotten thrift grains, cheap by the bag and able to swell a thin pot into a thick and hearty one. You browned a little tough stew beef, added an onion, a carrot, and a handful of pearl barley, then covered it all with water and let it simmer for a good hour or more. As it cooked, The barley plumped up and gave off its starch, thickening the broth into something almost like a stew, and the cheap beef surrendered its flavor to the whole pot. A small amount of meat went a very long way this way, carried by all that grain. Its strength was body and stretch, a filling and warming bowl that turned a scrap of beef and a cheap grain into a full supper. Its weakness was the time, the long slow simmer that a rushed evening could not always give. Barley also had the good manners to hold up in the pot for days, only turning heartier as it sat. This was cold weather food, the kind that fogged the windows and warmed a house to its corners. By the second day, the barley had drunk up so much of the broth that the soup turned nearly to a stew, and a hunk of bread on the side made it a full and warming supper. You can still see that barley swelling in the broth. When there was no beef at all, what cheap cut off the hog did your grandmother simmer with rice for a filling plate? Number 61. Pork neck bones and rice. Neck bones were about as cheap as pork ever got. Knobby pieces with a little sweet meat tucked into every crevice. And a careful cook knew how to get all of it. You seasoned them well and simmered them low and slow for a couple of hours, often with an onion and a shake of garlic, until the meat loosened and nearly fell from the bone, and the pot filled with a rich, savory broth, served over rice or alongside a mess of potatoes. That broth and those bits of meat made a supper far bigger than the price suggested. In black southern kitchens especially, neck bones were a staple, a way to put real pork flavor on the table for the least money at the counter. Nothing on those bones went to waste, and the last of the broth soaked into the rice, so the whole plate carried the pork. Its strength was flavor and thrift. Deep pork richness from a cut most stores nearly gave away. Its weakness was the patience it demanded and the picking it required. All those small bones a person had to work around at the table, but the eating of it was part of the pleasure, slow and hands-on and unhurried. The eating was slow work, but the family took its time, drawing every bit of sweet meat from the little bones. You can still smell those neck bones cooking down to tender. When the pork was gone, what pale, buttery bean did your grandmother simmer with a little ham for a soft and creamy supper? Grandmother simmer with a little ham for a soft and creamy supper. Number 60. Lima beans and ham. Lima beans, the big pale ones some folks called butter beans, cooked up soft and creamy in a way no other bean quite matched. You simmered a pot of them with a chunk of cheap ham or a ham bone, an onion and water, and let them go until the beans turned tender and the pot liquor thickened up rich and buttery around them. A little pork was all it took to give the whole thing a savory, smoky depth. Served with cornbread to sop up the liquor, it made a filling supper for a table full of people at a bargain price. Southern and Midwestern families alike kept dried limas in the pantry, sure of a cheap meal whenever the money got tight. The trick was to not stir them too hard, so the beans stayed whole instead of breaking down into mush. Its strength was that soft, creamy texture, and the way a scrap of ham flavored the entire pot. Its weakness was the cook time and the plainness, a long simmer for a bowl that a few children turned their noses up at. But those who loved butter beans loved them deeply, the mildest and most comforting of all the beans. A wedge of cornbread on the side gave you something to sop up that rich, buttery liquor at the bottom of the bowl. You can still see that buttery liquor clinging to the spoon. When you wanted beans that came out sweet and dark instead of savory, what did your grandmother bake low and slow with molasses? Number 59. Baked beans. Baked beans were the sweet, dark cousin of all those savory bean pots, cooked slow until they turned sticky and deep brown. You started with dried navy beans, simmered them soft, then baked them low and long in a pot with molasses, a spoon of mustard and onion, and a little scrap of salt pork laid on top. Hours in a slow oven turned the sauce thick and glossy, and let the flavor sink all the way into the beans. This was old New England thrift, a Saturday night dish that could sit in a warm oven through a whole day of chores and the Sunday morning that followed. Since some families would not cook on the Sabbath, molasses was cheap and it kept, which made it the sweetener of the poor kitchen. A crock of these could feed a family through the weekend and still leave enough for a cold spoonful straight from the pot. Its strength was flavor and keeping, a rich and hearty pot that only got better as it sat. Its weakness was the long bake and the sugar, hours of oven time for a dish heavy on the sweet. served with brown bread or beside a few franks. It stretched a bag of dried beans into a real supper. You can still smell that molasses baking into the beans. When there were only potatoes and an onion in the bin, what did your grandmother fry in a skillet for a quick and filling plate? Number 58. Fried potatoes and onions. Few smells said supper like potatoes and onions frying in a black skillet. You slice the potatoes thin, cut an onion into the pan, and let them cook slow in a good bit of grease, bacon drippings if you had them, turning now and then until the edges went crisp and brown, and the onions melted sweet into the whole mess. Salt and a heavy shake of pepper finished it. That was the entire dish, and it fed a family for the price of a few potatoes and one onion. It could be breakfast, it could be supper, it could be the whole meal or the thing that stretched a little meat into enough. Every region and every family had a hand in it, and no two skillets came out quite the same. The bacon grease was kept in a can by the stove, spooned out for exactly this kind of supper. Its strength was cheapness, and that deep, savory, browned flavor from the grease and the slow heat. Its weakness was the fat and the starch, a heavy plate with little else to round it out. But on a cold night, with the skillet hissing and the onions going gold, it warmed a kitchen like almost nothing else. You can still hear those potatoes crackling in the drippings. When you wanted potatoes baked soft and creamy in the oven instead of crisped in a pan, what did your grandmother layer up with milk? Number 57. Scalloped potatoes. When the oven was already warm, scalloped potatoes turned a few spuds and a little milk into a supper that felt almost fancy. You sliced the potatoes thin, layered them in a dish with flour, salt, pepper, and dots of butter or grease between the layers, poured milk over the whole thing, and baked it slow until the top browned and the potatoes went soft and creamy in a bubbling sauce that thickened itself as it cooked. A handful of chopped onion between the layers gave it depth, and a little grated cheese on top, when the budget allowed, turned it into something special. For families with cows, the milk cost nothing but the milking, which made this a cheap and hearty dish. It was the sort of thing a woman could slide into the oven and forget while she got the rest of the house in order. Its strength was comfort and value, a warm, creamy casserole from potatoes, flour, and milk. Its weakness was the long bake and the plainness without a little cheese or ham to lift it. Add a few scraps of ham or a slice of leftover meat between the layers, and it became a whole meal on its own. The top layer always browned the best, a golden, crackling crust that the children reached for first. You can still smell that milk bubbling up around the potatoes. When there was a bowl of leftover mashed potatoes going cold, what did your grandmother do to give it a crispy second life? Number 56. Potato cakes. Leftover mashed potatoes never went to waste, because the next night they came back as potato cakes. You mixed the cold mash with a little flour and maybe a beaten egg, shaped it into patties, and fried them in a hot skillet until the outsides turned brown and crisp, and the inside stayed soft and steaming. That crisp golden crust was the whole reward, a plain bowl of leftovers reborn as something worth looking forward to. They showed up everywhere, from humble home kitchens to roadside diners, an economical plate that cost nothing but yesterday's supper. Some folks ate them with a spoon of applesauce, some with a drizzle of syrup, and some just with salt and a runny egg on top for a full meal. The trick was a hot pan and patience, letting the cake sit long enough to build a crust before you dared to flip it. Its strength was thrift, a second supper conjured from food already cooked and paid for. Its weakness was that it depended on there being leftovers at all, and in the leanest houses, the mash rarely survived the first night. But when there was extra, this was the happy problem to have. A runny egg broken over the top turned a plate of yesterday's leftovers into a supper that felt brand new. You can still hear that patty crisping against the hot pan. When there was a can of corned beef and a few potatoes in the house, what did your grandmother chop and fry into a hearty skillet? Number 55. Corned beef hash. A can of corned beef and a few potatoes made a skillet supper that ate like a diner breakfast. You diced the potatoes and cooked them in grease until they started to soften, then broke up the corned beef into the pan and pressed it all down flat, letting the bottom crisp into a brown crust before you turned it in chunks. An onion in the mix gave it sweetness and depth. The salty, fatty corned beef flavored every bite of potato and stretched a single can across a whole family's plates. Topped with a fried egg, it turned into a supper that felt like a treat. This was the meal that turned a lean pantry into something that smelled like a busy morning at the corner cafe. Its strength was that browned, crispy, savory bottom comfort food that made the most of a cheap can. Its weakness was the salt and fat, a heavy plate that leaned on the potato for balance. Diner cooks and home cooks alike swore by the same trick, leaving the hash alone long enough to build that crust instead of stirring it to mush. A single can, stretched with enough potato, put a hot, filling plate in front of a whole family for the price of pocket change. You can still smell that hash crisping in the pan, when even a can of meat was out of reach. What did your grandmother stir into a white sauce to make a supper from a handful of peas? Number 54. Creamed peas on toast. When there was almost nothing in the house, a handful of peas and a little milk still made a supper. You built a white sauce from a spoon of butter or grease, a spoon of flour, and enough milk to loosen it into a gravy. Then folded in peas, whether fresh from the garden, canned off the shelf, or dried and soaked back to life. Poured over toast, it made a warm, gentle plate that filled a family for pennies. This was thrift at its softest, a way to turn the humblest vegetable and a splash of milk into something that ate like a real meal. It was the same white sauce that carried so many poor suppers, put to work here on the humblest green in the garden. Its strength was comfort and cheapness, a mild and creamy supper from a few peas and a little flour. Its weakness was plainness, a soft and simple plate that a hungry laborer might have found thin without bread underneath. Cooks brightened it with pepper, a pinch of nutmeg, or a chopped boiled egg when they could. It was the kind of quiet meal that got a family through the last night before the paycheck. It was the kind of supper a mother made, without a word of complaint on the last thin night before payday. You can still see those peas suspended in the cream over the toast. When the peas ran out but there was still an egg or two, what did your grandmother cream over toast instead? Number 53. Creamed eggs on toast. The same creamy white sauce that carried peas or chipped beef could turn a couple of hard-boiled eggs into supper. You made the sauce from butter or grease, flour, and milk, sliced 2 or 3 boiled eggs right into it, and warmed it all together until the eggs went soft in the cream. Ladled over toast, it stretched a handful of eggs across a whole family's plates, gentle and rich and filling. In homes that kept hens, this was a natural, a way to make the daily eggs into a hot meal without any meat at all. It cost nothing but the eggs and a cup of milk, and it came together in the time it took the toast to brown. Its strength was thrift and comfort, real protein from a few eggs turned creamy and warm over bread. Its weakness was the plainness, a soft supper that begged for salt, pepper, or a shake of paprika to give it life. Some cooks folded in a little chopped onion, or the last of a can of peas to make it more of a meal. This was the dish a mother reached for when the pantry was down to the basics, but the hens had done their job. You can still see those pale slices of egg in the cream. When there was cheese in the house but no meat, what did your grandmother melt over toast to make a supper the whole family loved? Number 52. Welsh rarebit. Long before anyone called it fancy, melted cheese over toast was a plain and filling supper that went by the old name of Welsh rarebit. You made a thick sauce from grated cheese melted down with a little milk or beer, a spoon of mustard, and a shake of pepper, then poured it hot and bubbling over toasted bread. The result was rich, sharp, and satisfying, a whole meatless meal built around one of the cheapest proteins in the house, a heel of cheese that might otherwise have dried out and gone to waste. Immigrant and working families alike leaned on it, since a little cheese went a long way melted down into a sauce. Some cooks stirred in a beaten egg to make it richer, or a splash of Worcestershire to deepen the flavor of the cheese. Its strength was that richness, a savory and filling plate from cheese, bread, and milk. Its weakness was the same richness turned heavy, a dense supper that wanted a sharp mustard or a bite of pickle to cut through it. Cooks used up cheese rinds and odd ends this way, wasting nothing. A slice of tomato or a few slivers of onion laid under the sauce turned a plain cheese supper into something that ate almost like a proper meal. And it cost next to nothing. You can still see that cheese sauce pooling into the toast. When you wanted that same melted cheese fried crisp between two slices of bread, what did your grandmother pair it with in a bowl? Number 51. Grilled cheese and tomato soup. Bread, cheese, and butter made the grilled cheese, and a can of tomato soup beside it made the meal a whole generation grew up on. You buttered the bread, laid a slice or two of cheese between, and pressed it in a hot skillet until the outside turned golden and crisp, and the inside went soft and molten. The tomato soup came from a can thinned with water or, on a good day, with milk, and the two together made a supper that satisfied even the pickiest child at the table. This became the classic pairing of the Depression and the lean years after. 3 cheap pantry things turned into comfort itself. For many children, this was the first supper they ever learned to make with their own hands, standing on a chair at the stove. Its strength was exactly that comfort, a crisp, gooey, warming meal that cost almost nothing. Its weakness was little more than the plainness. A supper you could dress up with a sliced tomato or a strip of bacon, but never really needed to. Dunk the crisp corner of the sandwich into the hot soup, and you had the whole point of it in one bite. Even now it can make a hard day feel manageable. You can still hear that sandwich sizzling in the butter. When you wanted that cheese baked into a whole dish instead of pressed in a pan, what did your grandmother stir together with a box of macaroni? Number 50. Baked macaroni and cheese. Macaroni and cheese baked in the oven was one of the great cheap comforts. A box of pasta and a little cheese turned into a bubbling, golden supper. You boiled the macaroni, stirred it into a sauce of milk, flour, and grated cheese, poured it into a dish, and baked it until the top browned and crisped, and the inside stayed creamy. Some cooks skipped the sauce and just layered the noodles with cheese, milk, and an egg, letting the oven pull it together into something almost like a custard. Either way, a small block of cheese stretched across a whole family for very little. This was Sunday-worthy in many homes and everyday in others. A dish that could sit at the center of the table or beside a scrap of meat. In many black Southern kitchens, this was a point of quiet pride, a dish carried to church suppers and holiday tables, and judged by whose came out best. Its strength was comfort and reach. Real cheese flavor turned into a filling casserole for pennies a plate. Its weakness was that it leaned heavy, a rich starch that a little pepper or a sliced tomato helped balance. Children begged for the crispy brown corners, where the cheese had gone dark. You can still smell that cheese bubbling under the crust. When there was no cheese at all, what did your grandmother toss a bowl of hot noodles with to make the plainest supper of all? Number 49. Spaghetti with butter. When there was no meat for a sauce, a pot of spaghetti still filled a family's stomachs. You boiled the noodles, drained them, and tossed them with a little butter or margarine and a pinch of salt, and if the shelf held any, a grate of hard cheese over the top. That was the whole supper, and it cost only a handful of coins for a box of pasta. Children twirled the long noodles around their forks and made a game of a dinner their parents knew was born of a thin week. Some mothers saved a scrape of butter from the morning toast in a little dish just for pasta night, and the water the noodles cooked in went into the next day's soup, so nothing was lost. A little pepper and a heavy hand with the cheese, when there was cheese, was the difference between plain and satisfying. Its strength was cheapness and ease, a hot and filling plate in the time it took to boil water. Its weakness was the plainness and the starch, a bowl with little to it beyond the noodles themselves, dressed up on the good dishes with a sprinkle of parsley from the windowsill pot. Even this could become company food. A little of the starchy cooking water, stirred in, helped the butter coat every strand so the plain bowl never felt dry. You can still see those buttered noodles glistening in the bowl. When there was a little tomato and a scrap of meat, what did your grandmother simmer to dress that same plate of spaghetti? Number 48. Spaghetti with a stretched meat sauce. On a slightly better week, that plain spaghetti got a sauce, and a little meat was made to feed a crowd. You browned a small amount of ground beef, or even just the drippings from a bit of sausage, then stretched it with a can of tomatoes or tomato paste thinned with water, an onion, and whatever dried herbs the cabinet held. Simmered down, that thin start became a red sauce with real depth, and a quarter pound of meat, flavored enough to cover a whole pot of noodles. Italian immigrant families brought this thrift with them, knowing how to make Sunday's small piece of meat feed a large table all week. The paste was the secret, a small can of it giving a whole pot the body and richness that fresh tomatoes alone could not. Its strength was that stretch, the way a scrap of meat and a can of tomatoes became a satisfying supper for many. Its weakness was the long simmer needed to build flavor from so little, and the way the meat spread that thin was more a rumor than a presence. But the smell of that sauce cooking down filled a house with the promise of a real meal. By Wednesday, the same pot of sauce, stretched with a little more water, was still feeding the family over a fresh boil of noodles. You can still smell that tomato and garlic simmering low. When you wanted noodles with no tomato at all, what did your grandmother brown in the pan to toss them in? Number 47. Buttered noodles. There was a humbler cousin to the spaghetti supper. A bowl of egg noodles tossed in butter that had been cooked until it turned nutty and brown. You melted butter in a pan and let it go past golden to a deep amber, watching it close so it did not burn, then poured that toasty butter over hot noodles with a little salt. The browning was the whole trick, turning plain butter into something rich and almost nutty that made the simplest bowl taste like more. Some homes crisped a handful of bread crumbs in the butter first and scattered them over the top for crunch, a poor cook's answer to a garnish. In many German and Eastern European kitchens, this was a familiar plate, comfort from noodles and fat and nothing else. Its strength was that deep, toasted flavor from one cheap trick with the butter. Its weakness was the plainness and the richness both, a bowl that needed the browned butter to lift it and a bite of something sharp to cut it. It was quick, it was warm, and it filled a child right up. A little grated cheese over the top, when the kitchen had a heel of it, made the bowl richer still, and a crumble of crisped bread crumbs gave the soft noodles a welcome bit of crunch. You can still smell that butter going nutty in the pan. When you wanted a plate of rice instead of noodles, what savory gravy did your grandmother pour over it? Number 46. Rice and gravy. In many Southern homes, rice and gravy was supper more nights than not, cheap and filling and endlessly forgiving. You cooked a pot of rice, then made a gravy from whatever fat and drippings the kitchen offered, browning flour in the grease, and loosening it with water or broth into a rich brown sauce. Poured over the rice, that gravy turned a bowl of the cheapest grain in the store into a hot and satisfying plate. The drippings might come from a little sausage, a scrap of bacon, or the bottom of a pan where meat had cooked earlier, and every bit of that flavor got wrung out into the gravy. A good gravy could be built from almost nothing, which is exactly why it anchored so many tight-budget kitchens. Its strength was thrift and comfort, a filling supper from a cup of rice and the fat that would otherwise have been wiped from the pan. Its weakness was that it leaned on starch and grease, a plate that a slice of tomato or a mess of greens helped round out. This was the meal that stretched the memory of meat across a whole pot of rice. A mess of greens or a sliced tomato on the side rounded the plate out, but plenty of nights the rice and gravy alone got a family fed. You can still see that brown gravy soaking down into the grains. When you wanted that rice cooked with a little organ meat for real Cajun soul, what did your grandmother stir up in one pot? Number 45. Dirty rice. Dirty rice took the parts of the animal nobody else wanted and turned them into one of the richest cheap suppers in the South. You chopped chicken livers and gizzards fine, browned them in a pan with onion, celery, and green pepper, then stirred in cooked rice and let it all cook together until the grains took on the brown, savory color that gave the dish its name. In Cajun and Creole kitchens, this was thrift raised to art, a way to use the giblets and the trimmings that would otherwise have gone to waste. The organ meats carried an iron-rich depth that made the rice taste far meatier than the pennies it cost. The holy trinity of Cajun cooking, the onion, celery, and pepper, did the flavoring work that expensive meat would have done in a richer kitchen. Its strength was flavor and thrift, a deeply savory plate built entirely from the cheapest scraps of a bird. Its weakness was the strong taste of the organ meat, which not every child took to, and the fine chopping the dish demanded. But done right, it stood proud on any table, holiday or weeknight alike. Made in a big pot, it stretched a few cents of giblets across a whole table, a dish that turned up at family gatherings as proudly as any roast. You can still smell that trinity cooking down in the pan. when you wanted those same cheap odds and ends stretched into a whole one-pot meal. What did your grandmother throw together with rice and a little sausage? Number 44. Jambalaya. Jambalaya was the great stretcher of Louisiana kitchens. One-pot rice dish that took a little of this and a little of that and fed a crowd. You browned whatever meat you had, a length of cheap sausage, a few scraps of chicken, maybe some of yesterday's ham, then cooked the onion, celery, and pepper in the same pot, added rice and tomatoes or just broth, and let it all simmer together until the rice drank up the liquid and the flavors married. A small amount of meat flavored a whole pot of rice, feeding a big table for very little. The dish grew straight out of thrift and mixing, African, French, and Spanish hands all leaving their mark on the same pot over the years. Its strength was that reach, a full and flavorful meal built to stretch scraps across many mouths. Its weakness was that it wanted a careful hand with the rice and the liquid, since too much or too little turned it to mush or left it dry. But a good pot of it was a celebration in itself, cheap as it was. A bay leaf and a good shake of pepper gave it backbone, and a pot of it could feed a porch full of family and neighbors on the price of one cheap link of sausage and a bag of rice. You can still smell that sausage and rice simmering together. When you wanted a soup thickened with okra straight from the garden, what pot did your grandmother put on to simmer low? Number 43. Okra gumbo. Gumbo could be a rich man's dish or a poor man's, and in a lean kitchen it leaned on okra and whatever scraps the week allowed. You started with a roux, flour cooked slow in grease until it turned the color of a copper penny, then built a pot around it with onion, celery, pepper, and sliced okra, which thickened the whole thing as it cooked and gave it body. A little sausage, a few shrimp when they were cheap and near the coast, or just the smoke of a ham bone flavored the pot, and it all went over rice. The okra was the poor cook's thickener, straight from the garden and free for the growing. Its strength was that a bowl of it ate rich and full even when the meat in it was almost nothing. Its weakness was the roux, which demanded patience and a steady stir so it browned instead of burned. This was a dish of deep African roots, the very word gumbo tracing back to an African name for okra. A pot of it simmered on the stove all afternoon, filling the house with the smell of the roux, and it fed a big family from little more than the garden's okra, a handful of scraps, and a mound of cheap rice to ladle it over. You can still smell that dark roux and okra cooking down, when the garden gave up its corn and beans at the same time. What did your grandmother cook them into together? Number 42. Succotash. When the corn and the beans came ripe together, they went into the pot together as succotash, a dish as old as the land itself. You cut the kernels off the cob, shelled a mess of lima beans or field beans, and cooked them together with a little water, a knob of butter or grease, salt, and pepper, until both went tender, and the starch of the corn thickened the whole thing. The name came from a Narragansett word, and the dish came from the native people who first paired those two crops, passed along to every settler who learned to farm the same ground. A scrap of salt pork or a little cream turned it richer when the kitchen could spare it. Its strength was thrift and freshness, a garden supper that cost nothing but the growing and put two crops to work at once. Its weakness was the season, since fresh corn and beans came only in late summer, though the canned and dried versions carried it through winter. It was cheap, filling, and honest, a plateful of what the garden gave. In the leaner months, the dried and canned versions carried the same dish through the winter, so a family could taste a bit of late summer even when the ground outside lay frozen and bare. You can still see that corn and beans steaming in the pot, when the garden gave you green tomatoes before they could ripen. What did your grandmother slice and fry from them? Number 41. Fried green tomatoes. At the end of the season, when frost threatened and the tomatoes still hung green on the vine, nothing went to waste, and those firm green globes became supper. You sliced them thick, dredged the slices in cornmeal or flour seasoned with salt and pepper, and fried them in hot grease until the coating turned crisp and golden, and the tomato inside went hot and tart and just tender. The tang of the unripe fruit against that crunchy fried crust made a plate worth looking forward to. This was Southern garden thrift, a way to eat the tomatoes that would never get the chance to ripen. Some cooks served them plain, some with a little gravy or a dab of something creamy on the side. Its strength was that it turned an unusable green tomato into a crisp and satisfying supper for almost nothing. Its weakness was that it was a seasonal trick, tied to the end of the garden's run, and heavy on the frying grease. But at that time of year, it was a small celebration of not letting a single thing go to waste. The very last picking of the season went straight into the pan, so not a single green tomato was left to freeze on the vine, and the tart crunch of them tasted like a small victory over the coming frost. You can still hear that cornmeal crust crackling in the grease. When the garden greens were bitter and needed taming, what hot dressing did your grandmother pour over them? Number 40, killed lettuce. In the spring, when the first tender lettuce came up in the garden, a southern cook could turn it into a warm supper with nothing more than a little bacon. You tore the young leaves into a bowl, then fried a scrap of bacon or fatback until the grease ran hot, and poured that sizzling fat straight over the greens, wilting them on contact. A splash of vinegar in the hot grease made a quick dressing, sharp and smoky at once, and the crumbled bacon went over the top. Folks called it killed lettuce or wilted lettuce, and it made a whole meal in the lean weeks of early spring when the garden was just waking up. A few boiled potatoes or a slice of cornbread alongside filled it out. Its strength was that it turned a handful of the first greens and one scrap of bacon into something warm and full of flavor. Its weakness was the grease, a heavy dressing over a light green, and the short season that gave you tender enough leaves. But that first killed lettuce of the year tasted like the whole garden coming back to life. A few boiled eggs sliced over the top, or a couple of new potatoes on the side, turned that handful of first spring greens into a supper a family looked forward to all winter. You can still hear that hot grease hitting the greens. When the yard grew nothing but weeds, what wild green did your grandmother wilt down and serve with an egg? Number 39, dandelion greens and eggs. Sometimes supper grew wild in the yard, and the dandelion was the first free green of spring. You sent the children out with a paper sack to gather the young, tender leaves before the plant flowered and turned bitter, then wash them through 2 or 3 changes of water to get the grit out. Wilted down with a hot bacon dressing, or simmered soft and finished with a chopped boiled egg. The slightly bitter greens delivered real vitamins after a long winter of stored food. Some cooks scrambled a couple of eggs right in with the greens for a fuller plate. This was true cost-nothing food, plucked from the same yard the family walked across every day. By the 1950s, dandelion greens were even sold in supermarkets, especially in Pennsylvania, where the taste ran deep. Its strength was that it was free and full of the nutrition a winter diet lacked. Its weakness was the bitterness and the washing, all that grit to rinse, and a flavor not every child welcomed. But those who grew up on wild greens often kept the taste for life, preferring them to store-bought lettuce even in flush years. The children who did the gathering learned to tell the tender young leaves from the tough old ones, a small skill that put free food on the table. You can still feel the sand rinsing off those leaves. When the yard offered a taller, wilder green, what did your grandmother cook down carefully with an egg to make it safe to eat? Number 38, poke salad. Poke salad was the wild green that came with a warning, a plant you had to know how to handle or leave alone. The young shoots of the pokeweed grew tall in ditches and old fields across the south, and a cook who knew the plant gathered only the tender early leaves. The safety was all in the cooking. You boiled the leaves, poured off the water, boiled them again, and sometimes a third time, because the plant was toxic raw or half-cooked, and only those changes of water made it fit to eat. Then it was fried in a little grease, often with a scrambled egg worked through, and it tasted like a rich, deep spinach. This was hard times food and springtime tradition both, so beloved it got sung about. Its strength was that it was free and abundant for anyone who knew the plant and the ritual. Its weakness was exactly that danger, a green that punished the careless and the uninformed, which is why the knowledge passed so carefully from one generation to the next. Handled right, it was a treasured taste of spring. Whole communities marked the arrival of spring by it, and the careful triple boiling passed from grandmother to grandchild. As one of the most important lessons a country cook could learn, you can still smell that poke frying with the egg when you wanted a sturdy green that simmered all day. What did your grandmother cook low with a piece of pork and serve with cornbread? Number 37, collard greens and cornbread. A big pot of collard greens and a pan of cornbread made a supper that carried whole families through hard times and holidays alike. You washed the tough, dark leaves through several waters, stripped out the thick stems, and simmered them low for an hour or more with a piece of smoked pork, a ham hock, or a bit of fatback, until the greens went silky and the pot filled with a dark, savory liquor. That liquor, the pot liquor, was half the point, sopped up with cornbread or spooned over it, rich with the vitamins cooked out of the greens. In black southern kitchens, this dish sat at the heart of the table, a food of deep roots and deep pride. Its strength was nourishment and flavor. Hearty greens and a little smoke turned into a filling, healthful supper for pennies. Its weakness was the long simmer and the labor of the washing, all that grit and those tough stems. But nothing else ate quite like a mess of greens with cornbread crumbled into the pot liquor. The pot liquor was so prized that some folks drank it straight from a cup, and a mess of greens cooked on the first of the month stretched alongside cornbread across many suppers. Richer each day it was warmed over. You can still smell that smoked pork cooking through the greens. When you wanted the whole vegetable, root and leaf both, what did your grandmother pull from the garden and cook 2 ways at once? Number 36. Turnips and turnip greens. The turnip was the thrifty gardener's 2-for-1, giving you a sturdy root below the ground and a mess of greens above it, both from a single seed. You pulled the whole plant, simmered the greens down with a bit of pork the way you would collard, and boiled or mashed the white roots into a soft, peppery side, or cooked them right in the same pot. Nothing about the turnip went to waste. It grew fast and late, holding on in the garden well past the first frost when other crops had given up, which made it a reliable supper deep into the cold season. Its strength was that double gift, root and green from one plant, cheap and hearty and forgiving. Its weakness was the sharp, earthy bite of the turnip itself, a flavor that split families the way liver did, loved by some and pushed to the edge of the plate by others. A little pork and a long simmer mellowed both the root and the leaf. In the dead of winter, when the garden gave up little else, the hardy turnip was often the only fresh thing left in the ground, and a family dug them out of the cold dirt grateful for a root and a green from one humble plant that had refused to quit. You can still smell those greens and roots cooking down together. When you had only a head of cabbage and a skillet, what quick supper did your grandmother fry up from it? Number 35. Fried cabbage. A head of cabbage and a hot skillet made one of the cheapest, most satisfying suppers a family could put together. You chopped the cabbage rough, threw it into a pan with a little grease, bacon drippings if you had them, and cooked it down over medium heat until the edges caught and browned, and the whole thing went sweet and tender. Salt, pepper, and maybe a scrap of bacon or a chopped onion were all it needed. Cabbage was one of the best bargains at the market, a heavy head for pocket change that fed a family for days and kept for weeks in a cool cellar. In many immigrant kitchens, German and Irish and Eastern European alike, this was a familiar plate, the old country cooking on an American stove. Its strength was cheapness, and that sweet, browned flavor the skillet coaxed out of a plain vegetable. Its weakness was the smell, which some found humbling as it filled a house, and the plainness without a little pork to lift it. But fried right, with some crispy browned edges, cabbage stopped being a chore and became a plate people asked for. A pinch of sugar or a splash of vinegar near the end played up the natural sweetness, turning a plain vegetable into a plate a family actually looked forward to. You can still smell that cabbage catching in the hot pan. When you wanted that same cabbage stretched into a soup that lasted all week, what pot did your grandmother put on? Number 34. Cabbage soup. When a head of cabbage had to feed a family for days, it went into a big pot of soup. You chopped the cabbage and simmered it in water or a thin broth with an onion, a carrot, and whatever else the crisper offered, maybe a potato or a handful of beans for body, and seasoned it with salt and pepper, and a splash of vinegar or tomato for brightness. A scrap of meat or a ham bone, when there was one, turned it richer, but the soup stood on its own without. It made a light, warm, filling meal for pennies, and a big pot lasted through several suppers, only tasting better as it sat. Its strength was thrift and reach, a huge amount of food from one cheap head of cabbage and a little else. Its weakness was that it could run thin and plain, a brothy bowl that leaned on good seasoning, and a hunk of bread to satisfy. Immigrant families across the country made their own versions, each seasoned by a different homeland. A pot of it cost little more than the one head of cabbage and stretched across 3 or 4 suppers, and a hunk of bread torn into the bowl gave a thin soup all the body a hungry family needed. You can still see that cabbage softening in the broth. When there was no cabbage at all, only the odds and ends of the week, what soup did your grandmother keep going on the back of the stove? Number 33. Perpetual soup. Some kitchens kept a pot going almost all the time, and one old cookbook called it perpetual soup, though most families just called it whatever was in it. Nothing edible ever hit the garbage. The vegetable peels, the meat bones, the wilted greens, the aging root vegetables, all of it went into a pot of water with salt and pepper, and the soup lived on the back of the stove, with new scraps joining the broth day after day. The water from cooking pasta or potatoes went in, the juice from a can of vegetables went in, and each night the family ate whatever version existed, knowing tomorrow's might taste entirely different. A handful of rice or barley gave it substance. Its strength was that it wasted absolutely nothing, turning what most kitchens threw out into a steady stream of suppers. Its weakness was that it was never the same twice and rarely much to look at. A humble catch, all that depended entirely on what the week left behind, but it stretched a household's food further than almost any other trick in the kitchen. Some families kept the same pot going for a week or more, and a child never quite knew what a bowl would hold from one night to the next, but it was always warm and always made from what would otherwise have gone to waste. You can still smell that ever-changing pot simmering low. When the only real flavor left was a couple of onions, what did your grandmother build a whole soup around? Number 32. Onion soup. Onions were among the cheapest and longest-keeping things in the kitchen, and from them a cook could build a whole soup. You sliced a few onions and cooked them slow in a little grease or butter until they turned soft, sweet, and deep gold, a patient step that pulled all their hidden sweetness out. Then added water or a thin broth and let it simmer into a savory soup. A slice of stale bread laid in the bottom of the bowl soaked up the broth and gave the thin soup some body, and a little cheese melted over the top. When there was cheese, turned it into a real supper. This was thrift at its plainest, a full meal built around the humblest thing in the bin. Its strength was that it cost almost nothing and warmed a body through, a savory bowl from onions, water, and old bread. Its weakness was the long, slow cooking of the onions, since rushing them left the soup thin and sharp instead of sweet and deep. But given the time, those onions turned a bare pantry into something that smelled like a French country kitchen. The long, patient browning of the onions was the whole difference, and a cook who gave them the time turned a bin of the cheapest bulbs into a soup that smelled like far more than it cost. You can still smell those onions going gold in the pot. When the garden overflowed with tomatoes or the shelf held a few home-canned jars, what soup did your grandmother make from them? And a little milk. Number 31. Tomato soup. When the garden overflowed with tomatoes or the shelf held a few home-canned jars, a pot of tomato soup came together for almost nothing. You cooked the tomatoes down soft with an onion, salt, and a pinch of sugar to cut the acid. Then at the very end and off the heat, stirred in a little milk or cream, easing it in slow so it would not curdle against the tomato. The result was a warm, tangy, faintly sweet bowl that a slice of bread or a grilled cheese made into a whole supper. Home-canned tomatoes made this a winter dish as much as a summer one. Each jar a taste of August pulled off the cellar shelf in February. Its strength was cheapness and comfort, a bright and satisfying soup from a few tomatoes and a splash of milk. Its weakness was that curdling risk, since too much heat or too fast a hand broke the milk and clouded the pot. But done gently, it was one of the most comforting cheap suppers there was. A grilled cheese alongside, dunked corner first into the hot soup, made a supper a whole generation still remembers by heart. And the home-canned jars meant a family could taste the summer garden long after the vines had died back to nothing. You can still smell that tomato and milk warming together. When there was only cornbread and a glass of cold buttermilk left, what did your grandmother make of the two? Number 30. Cornbread and buttermilk. For a lot of country families, a wedge of cornbread crumbled into a glass of cold buttermilk was supper itself. No cooking required beyond the bread already on the counter. You broke the cornbread into rough chunks, dropped them into a tall glass or a bowl, and poured cold buttermilk over the top, then ate it with a spoon as the bread soaked up the tang. It was the plainest kind of meal, two of the cheapest things a farm kitchen always had, and it filled a body on a hot evening when nobody wanted to light the stove. This was deep country tradition, eaten by field hands and farmers who had churned their own butter and had the buttermilk left over. Its strength was that it needed no cooking at all, cool and filling and nearly free. Its weakness was the plainness and the sour tang, a supper that a person either grew up loving or never came around to. But those raised on it spoke of it with real fondness, the taste tied to a grandmother's porch and a summer dusk. On the hottest evenings, when the kitchen was already sweltering, this cool, simple supper was a small mercy, filling a body without lighting a single burner. Some folks liked it soupy, with the buttermilk still loose around the crumbs, while others let it sit a minute until the bread swelled and the whole glass thickened into something closer to a pudding you could stand a spoon in. You can still hear that spoon clinking against the glass. When the cornbread was baked into a whole dish instead of crumbled in a glass, what did your grandmother make of it for supper? Number 29. Cornbread dressing. Cornbread dressing was not just for the holiday bird. In a lean kitchen, a pan of it could be supper all on its own. You crumbled day-old cornbread, softened it with broth, worked in a chopped onion and some celery and sage, bound it with an egg, and baked it until the top browned and the inside stayed moist and savory. Made with a rich broth from a few simmered chicken parts or giblets, it carried the whole flavor of a meal without much meat in it at all. This was a way to stretch stale cornbread and a little broth into a filling, fragrant dish that tasted like Sunday even on a Tuesday. Its strength was thrift and comfort, a warm and savory pan built from bread that would otherwise have gone hard and dry. Its weakness was that it leaned on having good broth and enough seasoning, since a dressing made with water and little sage came out flat. But a well-made pan of it, crisp on top and soft beneath, could anchor a whole supper. In many homes, this was too good to save for the holidays, a way to turn a pan of leftover cornbread and a little broth into a supper so fragrant that no one at the table missed the meat at all. You can still smell that sage and cornbread baking together. When you wanted a flat little corn cake fried on a griddle instead, what did your grandmother cook to go alongside a pot of beans? Number 28. Hoe cakes and beans. Before there were biscuits every day, there were hoe cakes, flat little cakes of cornmeal cooked on a hot griddle, and they went hand in hand with a pot of beans. You mixed cornmeal with water or buttermilk, a pinch of salt, and a little grease, then dropped the batter onto a hot, greased skillet and fried the cakes until the outsides crisped golden and the inside stayed soft. The name came from the old days when field hands supposedly cooked them right on the blade of a hoe over a fire, served alongside a bowl of beans. With the cake used to sop up the pot liquor, they made a full and honest supper. Its strength was cheapness and speed. Hot bread from nothing but cornmeal, water, and a hot surface. Its weakness was the plainness. A bread that needed the beans or a little butter and syrup beside it to feel like a meal. But those crisp-edged corn cakes turned a simple pot of beans into supper. The beans were the meal, and the hoe cakes were the bread and the spoon both, torn and dragged through the pot liquor until the last of it was gone, and a family could eat this honest supper night after night and never feel cheated by it. You can still hear that batter hissing on the hot griddle when the corn was cooked whole into soft white kernels instead of ground into meal. What did your grandmother pour over it for supper? Number 27. Hominy and gravy. Hominy was corn transformed, dried kernels soaked in a mineral wash until they swelled up soft and puffy and shed their skins. An old process the native peoples of this land taught the settlers who followed. You could buy it cheap in a can, or make it from field corn, and a bowl of it with gravy poured over made a filling supper, warmed in a little grease, then topped with a plain brown or milk gravy. The soft, chewy kernels soaked up the sauce and made a hearty plate for pennies. Ground coarser, that same hominy became grits, but whole it was a supper of its own. For families in the South, it was as ordinary as bread, a pantry staple that filled the plate when meat could not. Its strength was thrift and hardiness, a cheap and filling bowl from corn treated an old and clever way. Its weakness was the plainness, since hominy on its own was mild and needed the gravy, salt, and pepper to come alive. But it carried real history in every bite, a food older than the country itself. The old lye process that puffed the corn was ancient wisdom, handed down through generations, and it turned plain field corn into something soft, filling, and far more nourishing than the raw grain had ever been. You can still see that gravy pooling around the soft kernels. When that same corn was ground fine and cooked into a creamy pot, what did your grandmother serve it with for a breakfast for supper night? Number 26. Grits and eggs. Breakfast made a fine supper in a poor kitchen, and few things cost less than a pot of grits. You stirred the coarse ground corn slowly into boiling, salted water, and cooked it low, stirring often, until it turned thick and creamy. Then finished it with a knob of butter or a little grease, a fried or scrambled egg on top, or stirred right in. Turn that cheap pot of grits into a full and satisfying plate. When there was cheese, a handful melted and made it richer still. In the South, grits were the daily bread of the poor kitchen, ground from the same corn that fed the family a dozen other ways. Its strength was cheapness and comfort, a warm, creamy, filling bowl from pennies of ground corn and an egg or two. Its weakness was the plainness, since grits with nothing on them were bland, and it took salt, butter, and egg, or cheese to bring them to life. But dressed even a little, they made a supper that stuck with you. Whatever was left in the pot set up firm overnight, and could be sliced and fried the next morning. A second cheap meal, squeezed out of the very same pennies of ground corn, a little red-eye gravy from a slice of salt pork, or just a spoonful of the grease left in the pan, poured over the top, turned that plain bowl into something a working man could carry into a long afternoon. You can still smell that butter melting into the hot grits. When there was stale bread and a couple of eggs, what did your grandmother dip and fry to turn breakfast into supper? Number 25. French toast. Stale bread found one of its finest second lives, dipped in egg and fried. A dish so old that the French called it pain perdu, meaning lost bread. For the loaf it rescued, you beat an egg with a little milk, dipped slices of hard, day-old bread until they soaked it up, then fried them in butter or grease until the outsides turned golden and the insides went soft and custardy. A sprinkle of sugar and cinnamon or a drizzle of syrup turned it sweet, and for a poor family, it made a filling supper as easily as a breakfast. The whole point was rescue, taking bread too stale to eat plain and turning it into something worth looking forward to. Its strength was thrift and comfort, a warm, sweet, satisfying plate from a couple of eggs and a loaf that would otherwise have gone to the birds. Its weakness was little more than needing enough eggs and a bit of fat, both sometimes in short supply. But when the makings were there, few cheap suppers pleased children more. The staler the bread, the better it drank up the egg and milk. So the hardest, driest heels of the loaf became the best slices of all. Rescued at the very moment, they seemed fit only for the birds. You can still smell that cinnamon and egg frying in the butter. When you wanted a stack cooked on the griddle instead of dipped bread, what did your grandmother pour from a pitcher for a breakfast for dinner night? Number 24. Pancakes for dinner. When money was tight and the meat was gone, breakfast for dinner saved many a night, and a stack of pancakes cost almost nothing to make. You stirred together flour, a little baking powder, salt, an egg, and enough milk or water to make a batter, then poured it onto a hot, greased griddle and cooked the cakes until they bubbled and browned. A pat of butter and a pour of syrup, or just a spoon of jam or a sprinkle of sugar, and a filling supper was on the table for pennies. This was a favorite of children who never guessed that breakfast at supper time meant the week had run thin. Its strength was cheapness and cheer, a warm, sweet plate that pleased the whole table and used only the plainest pantry staples. Its weakness was that it leaned all the way towards starch and sugar, a supper with little to build a body, more comfort than nourishment. But on a hard night, a stack of pancakes felt like a small kindness. Children cheered to see the griddle come out at supper time, never guessing that breakfast at night meant the meat money had run out, and a stack of warm cakes with a little syrup made the leanest evening feel like a small treat. You can still smell those cakes browning on the griddle when there was little more than a couple of eggs and some broth. What quick soup did your grandmother stir up in a single pot? Number 23. Egg drop soup. Your grandmother did not need a Chinese restaurant to make this. Only a pot of broth, a couple of eggs, and a minute of her time. She brought the broth to a rolling boil, beat the eggs in a cup, then poured them in a thin stream while stirring slowly, and the eggs set instantly into silky golden ribbons that floated through the broth like little clouds. A pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, and it was done. The broth might come from bouillon, from chicken parts simmered earlier, or from the water something else had cooked in, and a couple of eggs turned it into real nourishment. This was the supper for a sick night or a tired one, gentle and warm and quick, when there was no appetite for much but a body still needed something. Its strength was speed and comfort. A hot, protein-rich bowl in 5 minutes from almost nothing. Its weakness was that it was thin and light, a soup that filled the moment more than the stomach, without bread alongside. But when you were worn down or under the weather, it went down easy and warmed you through. A few crushed crackers or a handful of rice dropped in gave it enough body to fill a stomach, as well as warm it on a sick and tired night. You can still see those egg ribbons winding through the broth. When there was a can of tomatoes and an egg or two, what did your grandmother poach right in the sauce? Number 22. Spanish eggs. When eggs were about all the kitchen had, poaching them in a pan of stewed tomatoes turned them into a real supper. You cooked down a can or a few fresh tomatoes with an onion, a little pepper, and whatever seasoning the shelf held. Then cracked the eggs right into the simmering sauce and covered the pan until the whites set and the yolk stayed soft. Some families called it Spanish eggs, and it was cousin to a dozen dishes from around the world that did the same clever thing. Spooned over toast or rice, the eggs and the tangy tomato sauce made a hot, filling plate for pennies. Its strength was thrift and heartiness, a satisfying supper from a few eggs and a can of tomatoes, a little protein made to feel like a meal. Its weakness was the plainness of the ingredients, which leaned on good seasoning and a slice of bread underneath to feel complete. But the sight of those eggs nestled in the red sauce made a poor supper feel generous. Nearly every kitchen in the world had a version of this trick, a poor cook's answer to a meatless night, and the sight of those soft yolks waiting to break over a piece of toast made even the leanest supper feel generous. You can still smell that tomato bubbling around the eggs. When the eggs were boiled instead of poached, what did your grandmother mash them into for a cold supper? Number 21. Egg salad. A few boiled eggs, mashed and mixed, made a cheap supper that needed no stove past the boiling. You hard-boiled the eggs, peeled and mashed them with a little mayonnaise or salad dressing, a spoon of mustard, salt, and pepper, and maybe a bit of chopped onion or pickle when the shelf allowed. Spread thick on bread or spooned onto a plate with crackers, it stretched a few eggs into a filling meal. On a hot night when nobody wanted to cook, or when the hens had given more than the family could use fresh, this was the easy answer. Deviled eggs were the fancier cousin of the same idea, the yolks mashed with dressing and piped back into the whites. For a church supper or a holiday table, its strength was cheapness and ease. Real protein turned into a cool, filling plate with almost no cooking. Its weakness was the plainness and the reliance on a little mayonnaise, without which it went dry. But a good egg salad, well seasoned, was a small pleasure and a reliable supper. In a house full of hens, it was the natural answer to a basket that had outrun the family's appetite, turning the day's surplus into a cool, filling supper that needed nothing more than a slice of bread and a shady spot to eat it. You can still smell that mustard and egg coming together. When the cornmeal mush had set firm overnight, what did your grandmother slice and fry it into for a sweet morning supper? Number 20. Fried mush. Last night's cornmeal mush, poured into a pan and left to set firm overnight, became the next morning's fried mush. One of the great 2-for-1 tricks of a poor kitchen. You turned the cold, solid block out of the pan, sliced it into slabs, and fried them in bacon grease or lard until the outsides went brown and crusty, and the inside stayed soft and steaming. A drizzle of syrup, molasses, or a little butter turned it into a sweet, filling plate that ate like a treat. This was thrift in its purest form. A single cheap pot of cornmeal carried across 2 meals with nothing lost. Its strength was that double life, a whole second supper conjured from leftovers and a hot pan. Its weakness was that it took planning, since the mush had to set overnight before it could be sliced and fried. But the reward was that crisp golden crust against the soft center, worth waking up for. The whole trick began the night before, when the leftover mush was poured into a pan and left on the counter to firm up. So a pot that had already fed the family once was quietly turned into a second, sweeter supper for the price of a little grease. You can still hear that knife scraping a slab of cold mush loose. When the potatoes and cheese were on hand and a little dough could be made, what did your grandmother fold and boil for a supper worth the work? Number 19. Pierogi. In the Polish and Eastern European neighborhoods, a Sunday of work at the kitchen table turned flour, potatoes, and a little cheese into pierogi, dumplings that stretched a few cheap things into a feast. You made a simple dough of flour, water, and an egg, rolled it thin, and cut it into rounds, then filled each with a spoon of mashed potato mixed with cheese or onion, folded them into half-moons, and pinched the edges shut, boiled until they floated, then often fried in butter with onions until the edges browned. They made a rich and filling supper. The work was the cost, a whole afternoon of rolling and filling and pinching, usually done by many hands at once. The women and children of the family gathered around the table. Its strength was that it turned the cheapest fillings, potato and onion and a little cheese, into something that ate like a celebration. Its weakness was exactly that labor, hours of careful work for a single supper. But the gathering was half the point, the making as much a family ritual as the eating. A whole afternoon of many hands folding and pinching filled a cellar shelf, so a family could pull out a dozen on a busy night and have a feast ready in the time it took the water to boil. You can still see those half-moons bobbing up in the boiling water. When the dough was cut into squares and dropped into a pot instead of filled, what Pennsylvania Dutch supper did your grandmother simmer? Number 18. Pennsylvania Dutch pot pie. Do not picture a crust, because Pennsylvania Dutch pot pie was nothing like the baked kind. This was a soup, a pot of broth thick with big square noodles rolled and cut by hand. You made a dough of flour, egg, and a little water, rolled it thin, cut it into rough squares, and dropped them into a simmering pot of broth, along with a little chicken or ham and some potatoes. The noodles cooked up soft and slippery and thickened the whole pot, and the starch off the dough turned the broth into something rich and hearty. Folks in that country called it bot boy, and it was cold weather comfort food, a way to make a little meat, and a lot of homemade dough feed a big table. Its strength was that reach, a filling and satisfying pot built mostly from flour and broth with just a little meat for flavor. Its weakness was the work of the dough, all that rolling and cutting before a single square hit the pot. But a bowl of it, thick with those soft noodles, warmed a person to the bone on a January night. The dough squares thickened the pot as they cooked, so a little meat and a lot of homemade noodle turned into a rich, filling bowl that warmed a whole family on a bitter night. You can still see those squares of dough sinking into the broth. When the dough was crumbled small instead of cut into squares, what soup did your grandmother drop it into? Number 17. Rivel soup. Rivel soup was thrift at its plainest, a pot of broth or milk studded with tiny lumps of dough called rivels, made from almost nothing at all. You rubbed flour with a beaten egg and a pinch of salt between your fingers until it crumbled into little pea-sized bits. Then dropped those into simmering broth or milk, where they cooked up into soft, tender dumplings that thickened the whole pot. Sometimes a handful of corn went in alongside, and that was the whole soup. This was a Pennsylvania Dutch supper built for the leanest weeks, when a couple of eggs, some flour, and a little milk were all the kitchen had left. The name came from the old German word for a lump, and the making of the rivels was a small skill children learned early, rubbing the dough just right. Its strength was that it made a warm, filling meal from the barest handful of pantry staples. Its weakness was the plainness, a mild and humble bowl that leaned on good broth and enough salt to lift it past thin. But it fed a family on next to nothing, and that was the whole point. A handful of sweet corn stirred in was all it took to turn the plainest pot of milk and flour into a supper worth sitting down to. You can still see those little rivels dropping into the pot. When the pantry held a bit of ham and a few potatoes, what did your grandmother layer and bake into a hearty casserole? Number 16. Scalloped potatoes and ham. When there was a little ham left over, layering it with potatoes turned two cheap things into a whole meal. You sliced potatoes thin, layered them in a dish with chopped ham, a scatter of flour, salt, pepper, and dots of butter, poured milk over the top, and baked it slow until the potatoes went tender in a creamy, bubbling sauce and the top browned. The ham flavored the whole dish. A small amount of meat spread across every forkful, and the potatoes turned a scrap of leftover pork into a supper that fed a family. This was the natural home for the last of a Sunday ham, stretched across a Tuesday night. Its strength was that it made a complete, hearty meal from leftovers and pantry staples, meat and starch and milk all in one dish. Its weakness was the long bake, an hour or more in the oven before the potatoes finally softened. But the reward was a rich, creamy casserole that tasted like far more than it cost. The dish was the natural end of a Sunday ham, the bone and the last scraps of meat put to work one final time. And by the time it came bubbling out of the oven, one would have guessed it was built from leftovers. You can still smell that ham and milk baking into the potatoes. When you had a little chicken and some vegetables to stretch, what did your grandmother tuck under a crust for a Sunday supper? Number 15. Chicken pot pie. A little chicken and a few vegetables, tucked under a crust, made a pot pie that stretched the memory of a bird across a whole family. You picked whatever meat was left from a stewed or roasted chicken, mixed it with a gravy made from the broth, and folded in a handful of vegetables, peas, carrots, potatoes, whatever the kitchen had. Then poured it into a dish and laid a simple crust of flour and lard over the top, baked until the crust turned golden and the filling bubbled up around the edges. It made a supper that felt like Sunday. The crust and the gravy did the stretching, turning a small amount of meat into a full, satisfying meal. Its strength was that reach and comfort, a rich and filling pie built mostly from broth, vegetables, and dough with just a little chicken. Its weakness was the work, all that picking of the bird and rolling of the crust before it ever hit the oven. But cutting into that golden crust to the steam beneath was one of the great small pleasures of a poor kitchen. Even the broth the bird had simmered in was saved and turned into the gravy, so that every last bit of one small chicken found its way under that golden crust. You can still smell that crust browning over the bubbling filling. When you wanted a little rice and meat wrapped up in a cabbage leaf instead, what did your grandmother roll and simmer for supper? Number 14. Stuffed cabbage rolls. In the Eastern European kitchens of the mill towns, a head of cabbage and a little rice turned a small amount of meat into a supper that fed a big family. You blanched the cabbage until the leaves went soft and pliable, then rolled each one around a filling of rice mixed with a little ground meat, an onion and seasoning. Tucked them tight and simmered the bundles low in a pot of tomato sauce until the rice cooked through and the cabbage went tender. Polish families called them galebki, and other homes had their own names, but the thrift was the same. A pound of meat stretched into rolls that fed a dozen. The rice did the filling work, while the small bit of meat carried the flavor. Its strength was that stretch and that deep, comforting flavor, a little meat made to feed many. Its weakness was the labor, the blanching and rolling and long simmering that made this a weekend project more than a weeknight one. But a pan of these bundles, glistening in tomato sauce, was a feast that cost very little. A big pan of them was a whole weekend's work, but it fed a large family for days and reheated even better, the tomato sauce sinking deeper into the tender leaves with each warming. You can still smell those rolls simmering in the tomato. When you wanted the same filling tucked into a whole pepper instead of a cabbage leaf, what did your grandmother stuff and bake? Number 13. Stuffed peppers. When the garden gave up its bell peppers, a little rice and a scrap of meat turned them into a whole supper. You cut the tops off the peppers, cleaned out the seeds, and filled the hollow shells with a mix of cooked rice, a little ground meat, an onion, and some tomato. Then stood them up in a baking dish, poured a little sauce around them, and baked them until the peppers softened and the filling cooked through. Like the cabbage rolls, the rice did most of the filling, while a small bit of meat spread the flavor around. It was a supper that looked generous on the plate, a whole stuffed pepper for each person, without much meat in it at all. Off-season, a cook made the same dish with whatever the shelf offered, though nothing beat a pepper picked warm from the garden. Its strength was that it stretched a little meat into a satisfying, good-looking meal built around a cheap garden vegetable. Its weakness was the bake time and the peppers themselves, which came cheap only in season. But a plate with a whole stuffed pepper on it felt like plenty, and that mattered. A little cheese melted over the top near the end, when the budget allowed, turned an already generous plate into something that felt like a real occasion. You can still smell those peppers baking soft in the sauce. When the meat had to be stretched even further into a loaf, what did your grandmother mix into the ground beef to make it feed everyone? Number 12. Meatloaf. Meatloaf was the great stretcher of the cheap kitchen, a way to take a pound of ground beef and make it feed twice the people it should. You mixed the meat with a couple of eggs to bind it, then worked in a filler that soaked up the juices and swelled the loaf. Breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or a handful of oatmeal, along with a chopped onion and some seasoning, pressed into a pan, topped with a smear of ketchup or tomato, and baked until firm. It turned a small amount of meat into a whole supper with slices left over for sandwiches. The filler was the secret, taking a pound of beef and stretching it to feed a family of 6. Its strength was exactly that reach. A satisfying, sliceable meat supper built around a fraction of the beef a family would otherwise need. Its weakness was that stretched too far, with too much filler, it turned dry and bready, a loaf longing for more meat. But balanced right, it was hearty, homey, and endlessly forgiving. The real gift came the next day, when the cold loaf was sliced thin for sandwiches. So a single pound of beef fed the family at supper, and again, in the lunch pails the following noon. You can still smell that loaf baking with the ketchup going dark on top. When the ground meat was rolled around a stuffing, instead of pressed flat, what fancy-looking supper did your grandmother make of it? Number 11. Mock duck. Mock duck was a bit of kitchen theater, a way to turn plain ground meat into something that looked and felt like a roast. You seasoned ground beef or sausage, rolled it out flat, spread it with a stuffing of breadcrumbs, onion, and whatever vegetables you had, then rolled the whole thing up, tied it like a proper roast and baked it slow. The stuffing stretched the meat, the roast-like shape lifted the whole meal in the eye of the family, and a gravy poured over it at the table pulled it all together. Nobody was truly fooled that it was duck, but that was never quite the point. The point was aspiration, a dish that reached toward the kind of Sunday roast a lean budget could not afford. Its strength was that it made a small amount of meat feel like an occasion, a humble supper dressed up as something grander. Its weakness was the work, the rolling and stuffing and tying and long baking. That made it a special day dish rather than an everyday one. But slicing into that roll at the table felt like a small victory over hard times. This was Sunday and holiday food, saved for the days a family wanted to feel, just for an evening, like the hard times were somewhere else. You can still smell that stuffed roll baking with its gravy, when the meat and vegetables were layered under a blanket of mashed potato instead. What pie did your grandmother build for a filling supper? Number 10. Shepherd's pie. Layered meat and vegetables under a blanket of mashed potato made a shepherd's pie, one of the great stretching suppers brought over by Irish and English families. You browned a small amount of ground meat, mixed it with a gravy and whatever vegetables the kitchen held, spread it in the bottom of a dish, then covered it all with a thick layer of mashed potato, and baked it until the top browned and crisped. The potato blanket was the trick, a cheap and filling lid that made a little meat down below feel like a whole hearty meal. Made with beef, it was often called cottage pie. Made with lamb, a true shepherd's pie. But in a poor kitchen, you used whatever you had and called it supper. During the Depression, immigrant families shared the dish widely, and it took easily to stretching. More potato and vegetable, less meat, whenever the budget demanded. Its strength was that reach and comfort. A rich, warming, complete meal built mostly from potato and vegetable with just a little meat. Its weakness was the several steps, the browning and the mashing and the baking. That made it more work than a one-pot supper. But that first spoonful, cutting down through the brown potato to the savory meat below, was worth every bit of it. You can still smell that potato crust browning in the oven, when the meat came from a can of pink fish instead. What did your grandmother bake into a loaf for a Friday supper? Number 9. Salmon loaf. A can or two of salmon baked into a loaf made a Friday supper that stretched cheap fish into a whole meal. You mashed the salmon, bones and all, then mixed it with a beaten egg, a handful of crushed crackers or breadcrumbs, a little chopped onion and some milk, pressed it into a loaf pan, and baked it until it firmed up and turned golden on top, sliced like a meatloaf, and often served with a creamy sauce or a squeeze of lemon. It turned 2 cheap cans into supper for a family. The soft bones mashed right in carried their hidden calcium, and the crackers stretched the fish to feed more. Catholic families especially leaned on it for meatless Fridays, turning a religious rule into a reliable weeknight plan. Its strength was thrift and nourishment, a filling, protein-rich supper from canned fish and pantry staples. Its weakness was the fishy plainness, which a good sauce, a bit of lemon, or a heavy hand with the pepper helped to lift. But a well-made salmon loaf, moist and golden, was a supper a family looked forward to. 2 cheap cans, stretched with crackers and an egg, put a hot, sliceable supper in front of a whole family, and the leftovers made a fine cold sandwich and a lunch pail the next day. You can still smell that loaf baking with its creamy sauce alongside, when a little ground beef and a box of macaroni were all there was. What one-pot supper did your grandmother stir together? Number 8. Hamburger and macaroni. 1 pound of ground beef, 1 box of elbow macaroni, and 1 can of tomato sauce made a one-pot supper that fed a family and asked for almost nothing. You browned the beef, drained the fat, then added the macaroni, the sauce, and enough water to cook the pasta right there in the same pot. 15 minutes later, you had a thick, savory supper that tasted like a stripped-down version of every casserole a mother ever made. Children loved it, and the leftovers tasted even better the second day, once the sauce had soaked into the noodles overnight. This was the meal a cook could make with her eyes closed. No measuring and no fuss. 1 pot and 1 burner, and a hungry family fed. Its strength was that reach and ease. A satisfying supper from a pound of meat, a box of pasta, and a can of sauce, all cooked in a single pot. Its weakness was the starch. A plate long on pasta and short on anything green, more filling than balanced. But it kept millions of families fed through lean weeks without complaint. 1 pot meant 1 pot to wash, which mattered as much as the price on a night when a tired cook wanted supper done and the kitchen closed. You can still smell that beef and tomato simmering with the noodles when you wanted that same little bit of beef stretched into a spicier pot with beans. What did your grandmother simmer up to last for days? Number 7. Chili with beans. Not the fancy competition kind with hand-cut brisket, but the poor man's chili, a pound of ground beef stretched with beans, until it fed a family for days. You browned the cheapest beef you could find in a pot, then added a can of kidney beans, a can of tomatoes, a good shake of chili powder and salt, and let it simmer down until the flavors came together into something hearty and warm. 30 minutes was enough, and the pot tasted even better on the second day than the first. For a cook feeding a family on little, this was the ultimate batch meal, made on a Sunday and eaten Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday without complaint. The beans made it filling, the tomatoes gave it brightness, and even the cheapest beef gave it enough substance to keep a body going. Its strength was that reach and heartiness, a spicy, warming pot that stretched a pound of meat across many suppers. Its weakness was little more than the sameness of eating it 3 nights running, though the flavor only deepened as it sat. Church food banks knew this recipe by heart, packing the ingredients together, because they knew exactly who would make it and how far it would go. A pan of cornbread or a sleeve of crackers on the side turned a bowl of it into a supper that stuck with you clear till morning. You can still smell that chili powder and beef filling the kitchen, when a little ham and some potatoes were baked together instead. What casserole did your grandmother pull from the oven? Number 6. Ham and potato casserole. When a little ham and a few potatoes went into the oven together, they came out as a casserole that fed a whole family from scraps. You diced the leftover ham, sliced or cubed the potatoes, layered them in a dish with an onion and a simple sauce of milk and flour, sometimes a handful of cheese on top, and baked it until the potatoes went soft and the top turned golden and bubbling. The ham flavored every bite, the potatoes filled the plate, and the milky sauce tied it all together into a rich, hearty supper. This was the kind of dish that turned the very last of a Sunday ham into a Wednesday meal, wasting nothing. Its strength was that it made a complete, satisfying casserole from a scrap of meat and a few cheap potatoes, the whole thing baked in one dish. Its weakness was the oven time, A long, slow bake before the potatoes finally gave in and softened. But the smell of it baking, ham and onion and bubbling milk, made a house feel taken care of. It was thrift you could taste. The very last of a holiday ham stretched into one more warm and filling meal, so nothing of a hard-won piece of meat was ever thrown away. You can still smell that casserole browning in the oven when a Sunday finally allowed for a real bird. What did your grandmother fry up crisp and golden to feed the whole gathered family? Number 5. Fried chicken. On the Sundays, a family could manage a whole chicken. Fried chicken was the crown of the week, and a good cook made one bird feed everybody. You cut the chicken into pieces so the parts went further, soaked them in buttermilk, dredged them in seasoned flour, and fried them in a deep skillet of hot grease until the crust turned deep gold and crackling, and the meat inside stayed juicy. A single hen, cut right, could feed a big table. The wings and backs and necks all counted, so nobody went without. This was Sunday food, the reward at the end of a hard week, the plate that turned an ordinary kitchen into a celebration. The buttermilk soak tenderized the meat, and the seasoned flour built that famous crust, a technique carried and perfected especially in black Southern kitchens, where fried chicken became an art. Its strength was that it made a real occasion of a single bird, a joyful, communal supper that a family gathered around. Its weakness was the cost and the work, a whole chicken and a lot of hot grease that came only on the better weeks. But that first crackling bite made every bit of the effort worth it. Even the pan drippings were put to use, whisked into a gravy that went over rice or biscuits, so the whole plate carried the flavor of the bird. You can still hear that chicken crackling in the skillet. When there was only tough, cheap beef and a lot of potatoes, what did your grandmother simmer low into a hearty stew? Of potatoes, what did your grandmother simmer low into a hearty stew? Number 4. Beef stew. When the beef was cheap and tough, the answer was a long, slow stew that turned the worst cut into the best supper. You browned chunks of the cheapest stew meat, then added potatoes, carrots, and onion, and enough water to cover, and let the whole pot simmer low for a couple of hours, until the meat surrendered and went fork tender, and the potatoes broke down just enough to thicken the broth. A little flour or a mashed potato gave the gravy body. The long cooking was the whole point, the only way to make a tough, cheap cut of beef melt into tenderness, and it filled a house with a smell that promised a real meal. A little meat and a lot of vegetables stretched into a pot that fed a family for days, and only got better reheated. Its strength was that it turned the cheapest, toughest beef into a rich and hearty supper, the vegetables stretching the meat across many bowls. Its weakness was the time, hours of low simmering before the pot was ready, a supper you had to start early and tend. But on a cold night, a bowl of beef stew was about as close to contentment as a poor kitchen came. A hunk of bread to sop up the last of the gravy was all it needed, and the pot only got richer the longer it sat. You can still smell that stew thickening on the stove. When there was no meat at all, only a bounty of vegetables, what big pot did your grandmother fill for the whole family? Number 3. Vegetable soup. A big pot of vegetable soup could feed an entire family from whatever the garden and the pantry gave, and it stretched further than almost anything else in the kitchen. You started with a broth, from a bone, from bouillon, or from the water vegetables had cooked in, then added everything the week offered: potatoes, carrots, onions, cabbage, a can of tomatoes, a handful of corn or beans, and let it all simmer together until the whole house smelled like supper. A little meat or a ham bone, when there was one, made it richer, but the soup fed a crowd with or without. Each pot was different, made from what was there, and no two ever tasted quite the same. This was the meal that fed a big family for pennies and stretched across several days, a bowl of everything the family had. Its strength was that reach and thrift, an enormous amount of warm, nourishing food from odds and ends and a little broth. Its weakness was that it could run thin without a good bone or enough seasoning, a soup that leaned on what you put in it, but a steaming bowl of it with a hunk of bread was a supper that warmed a whole family through. You can still see that pot of everything simmering on the stove when the family gathered for the one supper that meant home more than any other. What pot of tender meat and pillowy dumplings did your grandmother set on the table? Number 2. Chicken and dumplings. Few suppers set home like a pot of chicken and dumplings, and a poor kitchen made it from a hen too old to lay and a little flour. You simmered the chicken, even the bony backs and necks, in a pot of water with an onion and some celery, until the meat fell from the bone. Then pulled the bones out and dropped spoonfuls of biscuit dough into the simmering broth. The dumplings puffed up soft and pillowy, soaking in all that chicken flavor. And in 20 minutes the pot was full of tender meat, thick broth, and dumplings that dissolved on the tongue. This was the meal a Southern grandmother made when someone was grieving, sick, or just needed to feel loved. Carried in covered pots to doorsteps up and down the street. A little chicken and a lot of dough fed a whole family and left everyone full. Its strength was that deep, soul-warming comfort. A rich and filling supper stretched from one old bird and a bowl of flour. Its weakness was the time and care, the long simmer and the careful hand with the dumplings. But every time it was reheated, the kitchen smelled like someone still cared enough to cook. You can still smell those dumplings simmering in the golden broth. When the meat was gone entirely, and only dried beans and cornmeal remained, what did your grandmother put on the table that fed the whole family and asked no apology at all? Number 1, beans and cornbread. And here at number 1 is the supper that defined poverty cooking for 100 years and fed more families through hard times than anything else on this whole list. A pot of pinto beans, simmered low all day with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock, until the broth turned thick and brown and the beans went soft and creamy. A skillet of cornbread, golden and crackling, baked in a black iron pan seasoned by years of use, then broken into chunks to soak up the bean liquor. That was the whole supper, and it cost almost nothing. Pinto beans were the cheapest protein in the American grocery store, and they still are. A family that kept a bag of dried beans and a box of cornmeal in the cupboard would never go hungry. Across the rural South, the Ozarks, Appalachia, and the Plains, this was not a meal so much as the meal, the one everyone gathered around at the end of the day. There was nothing fancy about it. There was nothing to photograph or brag about. There was only a full pot in the middle of the table, a warm kitchen, and the whole family drawing in close, crumbling their cornbread into the pot liquor, passing the skillet, talking over one another, safe and fed. That was the joy of it. The money was tight, the week was long, but the beans were done, and the cornbread was hot, and everyone was home. You could not buy that feeling at any price, then or now. That is what your grandmother gave you, night after night, out of a bag of beans and a little cornmeal, and a whole lot of